Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories Podcast. I'm your host, John DeLynn. It is July 2nd, 2020, and we are so very excited to have with us today Shannon Caldwell Montez. Hey, Shannon, how's it going?
Good. Doing well.
So excited to have you with us today. For those of you who have been tuned in live, we just did several hours with Shannon. Let me just sort of introduce Shannon from a high level. So Shannon is the sister of a dear friend of mine, Steve Caldwell, Mindy Caldwell. They're dear friends of me and Margie. I learned about Shannon through Steve and Mindy. And today's episode is going to be, on the one hand, just sort of a normal kind of everyday average Mormon's kind of journey as a Mormon. So Shannon grew up in the Kaysville area in Utah, ended up going to the U of U. She and Steve both are huge Ute fans. I don't know if that runs in the family, but Shannon just lived the Mormon dream, went to the U of U, studied history, got her bachelor's degree, got married in the temple, had 4 kids, and kind of was living, I don't want to say the Mormon dream, but was, definitely doing the Mormon housewife, the Mormon mother sort of thing, as an Orthodox believing Mormon, but always kind of maybe internally struggling. Where things get really super interesting, maybe for me or for you, is that, after years of some cracks, about 4 years ago, Shannon really started to get into studying Mormon history and examining the Mormon Church's truth claims, its history. We just did several hours with Shannon because she ended up enrolling in a master's program at the University of Nevada at Reno, and for her master's thesis wrote this thesis called "The Secret Mormon Meetings of 1922" about B.H. Roberts and sort of a Mormon general authority and church historian that ended up questioning his faith, losing his faith in the historicity of the Book of Mormon, and informing all of the church leadership about it. We just did several hours about B.H. Roberts. If you haven't checked that out, check it out. It's fascinating and super important. We're going to be coming back with Shannon a few days from now to dive in deep about, the secret Mormon meetings of 1922. This is a fascinating thesis. It's a fascinating set of stories. You're going to love it. But what we wanted to do while we had Shannon in studio is have her just tell her Mormon story. And so that's why we're here, and that's what we're going to do. And Shannon, welcome back to Mormon Stories.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
So you've listened to some Mormon stories. You know how this goes.
Yeah.
So let's dive in.
Okay.
Tell us your Mormon origins and your Mormon story, kind of starting from the beginning.
All right. Born and raised in the Covenant, had pioneer ancestors and, people immigrating from Europe in order to join Zion. And, I just have the Mormon story on both sides as far back as there are Mormons, I'd say. I was born in Ogden, Utah, and moved to Kaysville when I was 7. I'm the third of 6 kids, and I got 2 older brothers and a sister just younger than me and 2 younger brothers.
Where's Steve in the birth order? And
Steve's just above me, so
Okay.
he's less than 2 years older than me.
And then you have a brother that's like mayor, like.
That's right.
Okay.
Yep.
And where is he in the birth order?
He's the oldest.
Okay.
And then, my sister, who's 20 months younger than me, we were 1 grade apart in school. Great friends growing up, had a lovely childhood together. And then 2 younger brothers who are also just, I have the most amazing siblings. They're, every one of them, just the best people. So.
Close family.
Close family. Yep.
And so to what extent was your kind of Mormon upbringing very traditional? Talk about the way Mormonism was manifest in your family's lives in your early childhood and maybe early adolescent years.
Yeah, I would say the church was the center of our lives. We were good Mormons. I wouldn't say we were, we did all the things. We went to church every week, we sometimes didn't do family home evening, and my mom feels terrible about that, but they did everything they could. They were the best parents, and they loved us, and we could tell, like, my parents did an excellent job of loving us and raising us the best way they knew how. And they're great parents. And we all got along, I'd say, pretty well. We had one of my earliest memories is actually being about, I would say I was probably 3 or 4. And my sister, say I was 4, she had just turned 3, because for like a few months, she was 1 year younger than me. And I didn't really understand birthdays, and I thought she was going to get older than me at some point. And I remember my mom saying, this was just my fear. And one time my sister and I were in a fight, and I remember my mom saying, well, the older one needs to be the peacemaker. And for some reason in my mind, I thought, if I wasn't the peacemaker, she would get older than me. So I just had this huge desire to be the peacemaker. So I would say in my family, I was always trying to be a peacemaker and trying to, just make things easy for everyone.
Did you, did your family try and do the scripture study and the family prayer?
Yeah.
And attend church every week?
We
and
tried.
all that stuff?
We weren't always successful at, scripture study and prayer, but, I knew my parents loved the gospel, and we definitely went to church every week and went to all of our activities and did seminary and, all the things. They were all expected of us, and my oldest brother, he was like, as a teenager, he had some struggles and anger, and, the program wasn't quite as easy for him to follow. And I would say the same for Steve as well, to some extent. They weren't, as straight down the middle of the Mormon path for some of their teen years. And
so Steve was a little bit of a troublemaker, huh?
He was. I think he was a little better at hiding it than Mike was. So Mike took more of the heat than Steve did. But they both, they kind of were my example of why we should follow the rules. I would say, I definitely, the Laman and Lemuel story, I was the Nephi. I could see that they were causing themselves and my parents a lot of unhappiness. And so I was like, well, the rules are the rules for a reason. And I'd learned that happiness comes from following the rules. There's just no reason not to do the right thing. So I was very focused. If I'd heard something said over the pulpit, that was a rule, and I was going to follow it. So I was definitely very dedicated to having the best life possible, and I was told that the way to have the best life possible is to follow as many rules as you can.
So what did your teenage years look like as a Mormon girl?
I was just really good. I had good friends. Dating was actually really, really scary for me. I feel like I had some scare tactics that worked really well on someone like me who's kind of anxious.
So what were you afraid of?
All of these talks about morality, I remember seeing that rafting video where people are falling out of the raft and they're like, this is like morality. And if you go into the rapids, bad things can happen, and you got to keep yourself safe and, just hold to the rod. And I guess the lack of sex education and and the abundance of telling people you have to be very careful, on some level, I think I believed all boys were rapists, because at some point they especially would lose control and not be able to help themselves. You can't get them too turned on, because at some point they're going to, they're not going to be able to control themselves. So dress nice so they can control themselves, and don't flirt too much so that they can control themselves. It was a lot about helping the boys control themselves. And so on some level, I believed that boys were pretty dangerous and that you shouldn't get them riled up because they couldn't control themselves. So, like, I realize that now. I remember anytime a guy liked me, I would, as soon as I felt like they might make a move, we were done. I stopped talking to them. I would like run the other way. And actually, even with Dave, who I ended up marrying, we were friends for months. And finally, he kind of just called my bluff and asked me to marry him before he'd even kissed me. And I knew I couldn't say no if he was a viable option. So, so I said yes. And then we kissed. And then, we had a normal relationship after that. But I was just so afraid because I feel like the scare tactics had completely worked on me and my anxiety level. So it was interesting. Like, I loved the gospel. I loved my friends. I loved EFY. I went to every possible EFY. I went to BYU, Rick's. I did an outdoor EFY. I wanted to be an EFY counselor, but they didn't hire me. But like, I loved EFY. I loved girls camp. It was everything to me.
How was your testimony? Did you try and get a testimony? Did you go to seminary? Did you think about the truthfulness of the church, Joseph Smith, the Book of Mormon? Did you do Moroni's Promise? What about your testimony?
Yeah, So I remember being in high school and being like, I better do that whole Moroni's Promise thing. I better pray about this. And I remember actually being a little bit scared to pray about it because if I got a real good testimony, I wouldn't be able to deny it and I'd really have to step up my game. So I kind of was doing it by default for a long time. And then eventually there were times that I was like, I don't know. It sounds a little, why can't we see those gold plates? Like, why isn't there a museum that has the gold plates? I'd really like to see them. So, there was parts of me that was like, that sounds a little far-fetched. But the other parts of me were like, well, there's just, this is what we do. This is what we believe. And by the time I really gave any voice to my doubts or to where it started feeling like, what if this isn't true? I was married and had little kids and thought, my husband would leave me. And so there was just no room to really question it. I was so young when I got married that I hadn't even become an adult yet, really.
Right. So regarding your thoughts about women and the role of women in society, your own personal goals and dreams, kind of feminist themes, your potential, what your purpose is in life. Do you remember having thoughts and dreams as a teenage girl about, maybe separate from what the church programmed you? Maybe you didn't have these thoughts, like where you felt pulled or where you felt interested versus kind of the path the church wanted you to be on, or any observations about equality of men versus women, any sort of feminist themes you want to share.
Okay. So I have 4 brothers and 1 sister. And so I did grow up noticing the differences between the boys and the girls. And, I remember my brothers getting these rafting trips and like these really fun adventures, and we couldn't leave our stake boundaries. And, they'd be like, well, these are scout activities, and that's why they get better activities. So, I remember being a little bit bummed by that, but I always kind of felt like I was fairly equal, that girls could be as smart as boys and that girls were as important as boys. Just personally, I felt that. I felt like the church maybe didn't necessarily help me feel that. I knew that my job was going to be to stay at home and have kids and be a mom. So I remember not wanting to take child development classes because I was like, I'm going to do that anyway. But it was important to me to get a degree. I hoped maybe to be a teacher or a writer. But, by the time I finished college, I already had a baby, and that wasn't going to work, to get a career. I wasn't going to put her in daycare because that was wrong in my opinion. So for me, actually, I felt like I was somewhat felt okay about being a girl until I went to the temple. And the temple cemented in my mind that I was less than my husband, and what I remember feeling a little bit like, oh, that was like the big truth that I took out when I went out of the temple, was that I need to support him. Like, that's what I vowed to do. And so I did my best to do that.
Did that feel right to you at the time? Was it uncomfortable?
I've had women who say they went to the temple and they heard that and they rejected it. And they were just like, oh, and I wish I had done that. That would have helped me so much. But in my experience, I was like, this is the highest truth there is. Like, I'm at the I go to the temple. I'm learning the most important things that God has to share with me. And I'm doing this, like, it's so sacred, we can't even talk about it outside the temple. And so I went and, I didn't reject it. I thought, well, this is what God wants me to do. This is the most important thing, is that, I obey my husband and I follow all the things. But I would say my two biggest takeaways from my experience in the temple was that I'm second to my husband. I need to support him. I need to hearken unto him. I need to do everything to make his life better. And number two, I need to give everything the church asks, including my life if need be. So those were my two takeaways. And I tried to implement those into my life with extreme dedication, because those were the highest, most important truths that we could learn.
So you bought in.
I completely drank that poison without even...
Poison?
Yeah.
That's a foreshadowing of what's to come.
Well, I do feel like it poisoned me. Yeah, because, and I
we'll
just
get there.
continued, I believed that and took it in and lived it as truth.
And when you say the teaching and you ended up feeling was poison that you bought into, what was the teaching again that now you're saying later you feel is poisonous?
I mean, it took a feminist awakening to start to make me feel like I could even be equal. That my opinions were anywhere in the realm of as important as my husband's.
So the poison was that women are lesser than men.
Right.
Right.
And that his life, that he mattered more, period. He was my God. When it comes down to it, he was my head and the person I follow, the person I'm dedicated to, the person whose life I support. It doesn't really go the other way.
Basically, you exist to support your husband.
Right. I'm his helpmeet.
Helpmeet.
He's not my helpmeet. I'm his helpmeet.
Okay.
So I was helping him meet all his obligations. Yes.
And just because I ask men about this all the time, and I want to be fair, you talked about conceptualizing, you talked about the teachings that you needed to be modest so you wouldn't give your husband or your potential husband or other Mormon boys any bad thoughts. And then you talked about, you policing their morality so that they don't become immoral. Did you have any thoughts of yourself as a sexual being? What types of messages did you internalize? Did you have any awakenings that way, conflicts, shame? Was sexuality or even secret, overt sexuality anyway part of your teenage years or young adulthood in any way that's worth mentioning? I was extremely uncomfortable with being a sexual being at all. I tried not to even have crushes. I had crushes, but I tried so hard to be pure and good, and I was so afraid of dating. As I said, it seemed so fraught that for me it seemed easiest to just avoid the whole thing. I hardly even would talk to boys because I was afraid it would lead somewhere, and also I was afraid of getting married young. So I didn't want, I knew that it was righteous to get married and not put off education and stuff. So I kind of didn't want to lead someone toward that. So I was just very, until Dave came along, nobody could break that wall of just distance. I just kept distance. So you kind of shut down in that way. Yeah, I shut down as much as I possibly could. Okay. Okay. So, you talked to us about meeting Dave and going to the temple.
Yeah.
What was kind of your agreement or understanding, either explicit or just understood, in terms of what role belief in the church would play in your marriage and in your life? Does that make sense?
Yeah. I mean, so we met at Rick's College, and
that says something.
yeah, we were in the same ward, and it was understood that this was the center of our lives. He'd just gotten back from a mission to Brazil where he'd been very successful as a missionary and had lots of converts and lots of success. And, he was still on fire. And this is something that I've realized recently, is the ways that our beliefs undermined even our ability to love each other. Because I feel like he was less hung up on, actual like adherence to rules. He adhered to the rules, but he didn't think that the rules on their own necessarily were as important as just the spirit of the law, right? So I've realized, since things have changed, but that our beliefs undermined our marriage in the fact that I believed that he was supposed to get married within a year of coming back from his mission, and he was coming up on a year. I kind of believed that he liked me because I was so pure. Like, I was a good, pure, virtuous woman who, completely saved myself for the right person, and who had received these commandments in like all my religion classes and whatever, that the most important thing to do is get married and have children. And if you put off family and marriage for education, that's selfish. And so I feel like I went into the marriage more out of obligation. I would have loved to wait a few months. There was part of me that was terrified to get married at that point, and that if I'd had the choice, I would have waited. But I also knew that you don't play with fire. Boys can't control themselves. You have to coddle these guys and not make it too hard for them. And so, you don't get engaged and stay engaged for very long. So 6 weeks after my first kiss, we were married.
What?
Yeah. It was
6 weeks.
Crazy. Yeah. So that seems a little weird and unhealthy, but I was like keeping everything at bay for so long. It wasn't Dave's fault. Dave was not a prude like I was. He'd had girlfriends, he'd had experiences. So this wasn't him. This was me saying, if you want to hang out, we can hang out, but not if you're going to try to make moves on me. We're just friends. We're just friends. We're just friends. And we were like best friends. And finally he's like, I think we should get married. And I was like, oh, like terrified. But I knew that the commandment was that I needed to just do this. And I liked him. I enjoyed hanging out with him. And I figured if I'm going to get married, he's a great person to get married to. So let's do this. But I didn't feel like I doubted the fact that he loved me for me. I thought he loved me for my virtue. And that, comes into play later when I'm like, if I'm not a Mormon, he's probably not going to want me.
Yeah. So you guys get married, you're 19, he's 21, 22.
Yeah.
And
22.
And I'm guessing you guys start having babies really quick.
Yeah. So before we got married, we read all the literature on should we use birth control or not? And we decided that we should just stay close to the spirit and have as many kids as God tells us to, but that we didn't necessarily need to avoid all birth control. But about 9 months into the marriage, I was, I didn't want to stay on the pill. I was like, let's try something else. And he was like, maybe it's time to start thinking about kids. And I was like, I don't know. I'm not I don't feel ready. But then he prayed and felt confirmation that it was time to have kids. And, I remember being like, I'm not sure about this. But you know what? If the Spirit's going to talk to someone, it's going to be him, because, he's the head, he's the priesthood head. So I was like, okay. And then within a month, we were pregnant. So we had a baby a year and a half into our marriage. I mean, I love my kids. They're amazing people and I love it. But again, like with my marriage, I felt like if I'd had to do it on my own timeline, it wouldn't have been as quick as it had been. I just didn't feel like the choices were mine to make.
Yeah. It's that issue of consent that we talked about in our interview we just did.
Well, and I just never felt empowered. Like I was to defer to the men in my life, the priesthood people. So if I'm getting a talk from a seminary or, from over the pulpit, I mean, there were talks that I can point out at this time that were talking about marriage and how you don't put it off and education. These were fresh on my mind and the proclamation had just come out. It was like, get married and have kids. This is the most important thing you can do in your life. No failure, success can compensate, whatever that quote is. And any two people can get married as long as they're righteous. So all these things kind of pushed me into saying, well, this is the right thing to do. I have to do it now.
So, I mean, so far this sounds like the Mormon dream. Like you're staying chaste. Forgive me for using these words, but you're staying chaste, you're staying moral, you're getting married in the temple, you're marrying your returned missionary, and you're having kids. Like, right. What's not to love?
I am the church's success story.
Yeah.
I am exactly what they wanted.
So what's wrong? What's going wrong here? I don't see the problem.
I am being a perfect servant of the church, but I am not being a perfect servant of Shannon, right? What I want doesn't matter.
Okay.
But what the church wants does.
So how does that, give us some examples or talk us through how that.
Well, I was playing my role, and I've been told that this is the best way to happiness. The gospel provides happiness and following the rules provides happiness. And I wanted a happy life. So, the more rules I could follow, the happier I'd be. And therefore, if I put off marriage, I probably, I can't ask him to wait for me. So I would probably end up being punished by having to wait till I'm really old to get married. This was my reasoning. Or if I put off having kids, I would probably get really crappy kids. God would send the worst ones to me because I'm not righteous enough to welcome the good ones or something like that. So I just had all these like little fears and deals that, if I did this, then God would reward me for following the rules. But yeah, I would say it looked like an absolute success story. The program worked on me. I avoided all the pitfalls of sex and dating. I ended up with a good returned missionary and a beautiful bunch of kids. But
what was wrong? And when did it start?
Well, again, I was drinking poison this whole time. I was.
So far, it doesn't sound poisonous. So explain to us.
I was killing my own spirit. Sorry. In order to make myself fit these roles, I was cutting off every piece of me that had any resistance. I would shut her up. I would shut her down, tell myself I didn't matter, like what I wanted didn't matter. I forced myself to be this character that didn't have hopes and dreams and that didn't have desires outside her family or have her own ambition. My ambition was to be his ambition was my ambition. I had to scrub myself of myself in order to fit this role. And so I feel like it does some real damage to the women who follow the program. They lose themselves in order to be a good Mormon in so many ways.
So you got lost. You lost yourself.
Yeah. I tried not to be a person. I had a personality and I wanted to, I tried to just be as much of myself within this box as I could be, but to never look outside this box, to never hope outside this box, to never, acknowledge there was anything outside that box of perfect wife and mother, because there's no happiness outside of this box. So me filling this box as much as I could would make me the happiest person I could be, and that's all I should or could hope for. And it all was kind of contingent on my being good and my being righteous and my following the plan.
Are there points where you remember thinking, I should be happy, but I'm not? Do you remember points where you had those types of thoughts?
Yeah. Well, so some things that I remember, so Dave and I, start out fine. Everything's great. We're enjoying married life. And then I found out that he's, he repented of things in the past. I mean, nothing major, like really. But he was like, I didn't feel like I needed to tell you these things because they'd been made clean and washed away. And, and I felt weird about that. But rather than being bothered that he hadn't fully disclosed everything, I felt guilty for not being forgiving enough, for not, for having any problems with anything at all. And I feel like that was one way that beliefs that, repentance makes everything disappear did some harm to me, because I felt like he didn't feel like he had to fully disclose everything to me, and I didn't feel like I could ask because he'd been forgiven. And then I felt guilty for not being righteous enough to act like nothing had happened, right?
So let me try and tease that out just a tiny bit. So what I'm hearing, number one, is you saved yourself for him in to a certain level.
I mean, to the point where I had not even kissed anyone.
Right. Yeah. So, okay. So he was the first person you kissed?
Yeah. And then 6 weeks later, we're married. Like, I am that pure.
So one is you sort of kept your game at this level, and then you're finding out that he had only kept the game to this level. So there's the disparity.
Right.
And then there's the fact that he hid it from you. Right.
And he didn't feel like he'd hidden it.
Because he felt like he was forgiven.
Right.
But
and the church had told him that he'd been forgiven, and his mission president told him that he'd been forgiven. This doesn't exist.
Yeah.
And so when I found out that something had existed, I felt a little betrayed in some way, and then I felt guilty for feeling bad about it.
Was it because you wished there was a part of you deep down that wished you had a chance to experiment more, or that you weren't marrying the level of righteousness that you weren't getting the level of righteousness that you thought you were getting?
It wasn't that I felt like he needed to be the level of righteousness I was. I knew I was a little bit over fearful. Like, even at the time, I'm like, I don't know why I'm so terrified. But now I can be like, well, because they were all rapists. Like, in some level of my brain, I thought I actually remember coming back from my honeymoon and being like, wait a minute, we never lost consciousness. Like, we could have stopped at any point. There was always a point where I could have said, I don't want to do this. And we could have stopped. There was no point that just animal instincts took over. I had, before I got married, thought that at some point you lose control. So I remember being surprised that we hadn't lost control. It's just there's so much talk about how you have to keep it under control that I thought you could lose control. And that at some point you just weren't in charge of yourself. And then that was a little surprise to be like, wait a minute, we were in control that whole time. Actually, people can say no and people can stop. This isn't like some runaway train that you can't. So yeah, I didn't need to be as afraid of it as I had, but I didn't know that. I stayed so far away from it that I couldn't even imagine the reality of it.
And at that point, as a new Mormon bride, would you have had the thought? Because a lot of men that I talk to, and some women who leave the church in their 30s or 40s or 50s, are like, oh, I could have had other sexual experiences. I could have experimented. I could have tried different things or gotten to know myself better. had more sex positivity, I'm wondering, I'm guessing that you wouldn't have had that thought as a 19 or 20-year-old Mormon bride, but
yeah, it wasn't so much that
Okay.
I'd lost out on stuff. I felt like even just with Dave, it would have been nice to have been less nervous, done a little more, just making out or whatever.
just why was I so afraid?
Yeah,
Well,
why did I have to be so scared of everything? This isn't a big deal. So being a
Okay.
little surprised at how overblown the whole morality issue
Right.
had been and
Okay,
how
got it.
deeply I had taken that in and been like, this is really dangerous. They're talking about it all the time.
Yeah.
This is a big issue. I need to be really careful. And so I was. And then realizing I didn't need to be as careful. So I would say it wasn't so much that, I guess one thing I realized later, so every time I would think about him having a past that I hadn't been aware of and wondering, would I have made the same choices if I had known, full disclosure? And it was the fact that maybe he'd kept it from me, afraid that I would make a different choice, and therefore I was kind of forced into the choice that he wanted rather than the choice that I wanted. And we've discussed that and we've gone over that, and he's amazing, and he's like, leaving the church has been the most amazing thing for our marriage.
We'll
And
get there.
I just wanted to make this clear that a lot of these things were because of the dynamic we were set up with
Yeah.
rather than the types of people we actually were.
Okay, so let's keep digging. So in addition to you realizing that sex was different than you had been taught, what are other dynamics or feelings that started to creep up in you as you were married and started having kids where you weren't feeling great or happy?
I think motherhood was just overwhelming. So, I love my kids, but I started out, I had a very deep depression with my first one, like clinical depression. And I didn't realize when I was going through it that it was depression. I just thought, well, my life has changed and I'm not getting sleep. And it's just really hard to be a mom. And it's really hard to enjoy this. And I really didn't understand that I could have gotten help until she was, close to a year. And I remember being like, whoa, I feel so much better. What happened? That was really dark. That was really kind of scary. And, I kind of came out of the fog and realized that had been really terrible. But, I went into motherhood expecting this will make me so happy. And it didn't. In fact, it was the hardest time in my entire life, those first few months. And I felt so inadequate and so like this perfect, beautiful child deserved something better. And I was too young to do this. I was unprepared to do this. But I remember holding my daughter and being like, I'm the wrong person for this. I can't do this. And I have to do it for 18 years. I've made this choice that I can't undo and she deserves better, but what do you do? I have to do this for 18 years. There's no quitting. Luckily, I got over it, had 4 more kids, loved being a mother, but, it was really rough at first.
And I'm imagining 2 types of listeners right now. One, a group of listeners, maybe a lot of women that are just like, I totally am right there with you, Shannon. I felt the same way. Mm-hmm. And then I can think of others that are just like, yeah, that's what it's like to be a mother. Like, okay, it was hard. You were depressed. Motherhood's hard. Mm-hmm. No, welcome to the world. And you're glad you're a mom and you love your kids. So how was that a bad thing or a hurtful thing? You just had a hard time as a mom like every other mom. Right.
Yeah. I remember the dissonance of being like, this should make me happy. And I would talk to other moms and be like, oh man, isn't this rough? And they'd be like, I just love my baby so much. And I would be like, I'm the only one. I am just not good enough. I'm a terrible person because this just doesn't come naturally to me. And this is really hard. And I'm not good at this. And homemaking is the struggle. I just felt like it was me. And I remember after that, after I realized it, I would always try to talk to new moms and be like, it's really hard. And are you okay? Because there were moms that it is easy for them and that having a baby is just the most beautiful, wonderful thing. And I experienced that with the others. But my initiation into motherhood was dark and scary and hard. So I would say there was, some kind of disillusionment, just like, I am 21 years old. What have I done to my life?
Yeah.
And I remember changing my third child's diaper and being like, I was supposed to be in Europe. Like, I should be backpacking right now. Instead, I'm changing my third baby's diaper. What am I doing? So it was really just, I had plans to finish college and travel and do all these things, but, you don't question God's timing. And it came faster than I wanted, but, accept it as it is. And, it's my job to just make it work.
Okay, what about the marriage itself? What about your relationship with your husband? He presides, you nurture the children. He's kind of the head and you're the heart.
Right.
And, he's busy earning a living and serving in callings and you're taking care of the home and the kids. How did that bode for your relationship?
So I feel like Dave and I fit really neatly into gender roles naturally. He's a natural leader and he's a hard worker and he's career driven. And so he fits that gender role really well. I fit the stay at home, the take a back seat, defer to him naturally as well too. It's funny because my parents have the opposite. My mom is a lot more driven and my dad's a lot more like me, just kind of go with the flow. So in their situation, it kind of equalizes. My mom's pushing my dad forward and my dad's kind of pushing my mom forward. So it turns into some kind of equality because she's just more naturally the leader in their relationship. In my relationship, I would say that gender role expectations pushed us even farther into these gender roles where I am the nurturer and he's the provider. And so as far as parenting, I did all the parenting and he did and also we were young. He was finishing college and trying to work and support the family. He didn't have a lot of time left or energy. And I would feel bad for him. So I would get up and do all the night feedings and changings. And on the weekend, I would try to tell myself, well, he works all week and you might be able to take a nap. So you don't deserve to sleep in, and he does. And so, I was doing everything I could to make his life easier without really looking to get any help for me. In fact, there's one story, he's going to hate that I'm telling this, but it illustrates kind of the rigidity of our gender roles, that we were both believing. It's not just that he took my power, I also gave him my power, right? It wasn't just him presiding and dominating. It was me submitting and pushing it towards him as well. So he had more responsibility than he wanted in some ways too. But this story is that I'm in the depths of postpartum depression and he comes home from work and I've had this baby and she's it's just fussy or something. And I've just had it. And I'm like, please take the baby. I can't do this right now. And he's like, you need to deal with your frustration. You need to learn how to, mother, basically. I'm not going to take the baby. You need to learn to deal with this. And at that point, I wanted to kill him and the baby and leave. I was just like, what do I do? But so, yeah, he tended to believe that those roles weren't for him. He didn't need to do as much housework. If he did, he deserved praise and gratitude, but it wasn't really expected. And I didn't really expect it, to be honest. So again, it's not just him taking this role and forcing me to be the subservient wife. I was also trying to be a good subservient wife, just because these are the roles that we're trying to fulfill. So yeah, I was doing the parenting and he was doing the providing, and we tried not to really get in each other's ways. But presiding doesn't really mean getting in and getting dirty and helping out. It means offering criticism and direction and That's what it felt like a lot of times in our strict gender roles, was that it was his job to find ways that I could do better and my job to do those things better.
So was there, as this continued over time, so how many years was it between your marriage and the beginnings of your faith crisis? I guess 4 years ago. How many years?
I would say our marriage took a big turn. I kind of feel like we have two marriages. You know how Estelle Perel's like, people have 3 marriages in life. And I would say our first marriage was 15 years. Mm-hmm. And our second marriage has been the last 10. So even before I left the church, we had a giant shift in our marriage where I had started to find my voice. And that kind of is where it led me out. But I would say 15 years of trying so hard to fulfill these gender roles and to do these highest, Mormonism's highest calling, which is to be a helpmeet to my husband and for him to preside. 15 years of really struggling to just be the best Mormons that we possibly could. And for many of the men out there, we talk about like LGBT people and they become suicidal, or we talk about people of color and how they're viewed as like, cursed because of their skin color. I want to, and you've already started communicating it very well, but I just want to really drive it home. I can see some men out there going, okay, you married kind of early. You didn't get to pursue a career, your dreams. But, we're here to have kids, and you had kids. Mm-hmm. And yeah, there's specialization where he's working outside the home and you're staying home, but that's good for the kids. Yeah, it's hard as a mom, but it's hard as a dad, and it's being a parent is hard. And yeah, okay, yeah, there were some hard things about it, but look, you're married, you've got kids, everybody's getting an education and thriving. Like, what's the problem? Why is that a problem? I've explained it to Dave like this. Dave, he's got his education in accounting. And I was like, so when you grow up, you could be anything you want and a dad. For me, it was like, what if everyone has to be an accountant? Boys are good at the numbers, and so all boys have to be accountants. It doesn't matter whether or not you like it, or even if you're good at numbers. You have to be an accountant because that's just your job, and that's the only job that's available to you. That kind of turned on a light bulb for him, because he was like, oh yeah, I had all the options I wanted. I could be whatever fit me the most, but I only had the one option. And I feel like if you have a choice, that's a different story. I've talked to a lot of women who gave up their career and had babies, and, they just seemed more content with the whole thing. They chose it. And even friends who'd only been, say, I have a couple of friends that were a teacher for 3 or 4 years before they had their kids. Even though they hadn't taught in 10 or 15 years, they're still saying, oh yeah, I teach high school, or I taught high school. I'm a teacher. They had this other aspect of their identity, and they knew they had put that part down for a little while, but that they would probably pick it up again someday, and that they were more than a wife and mother, that they were this person on their own. And I felt like I was not allowed in my own, I know I chose these things, but those were because that's the choice that to make a different choice was a bad option.
It wasn't really a choice.
Choices were the good option, right?
Yeah, growing up Mormon in Utah, there's not a lot of choice.
It wasn't the right choice, and you can only make the right choice. So, yeah, I felt like if I had...
It's like choose A or A, either one.
Right. Or choose A or go to hell. Okay, I'll choose A. So, I feel like even just having felt like I had chosen to do this would have made a huge difference. And actually, my sister is a perfect illustration of the difference, because she, we were raised in the same house. She didn't go to a church school, and she still followed the program. She's still to this day a very wonderful, amazing Mormon who's living the gospel in the most healthy way, I believe, possible for a Mormon to do. So I think it can be done well, and I think she is someone who is doing it well. But But she is someone who felt she had choices. She got married young, but partly because she was like so excited to go travel the world with her husband. So they got married, took a 3-month honeymoon to Vietnam, came back. She worked for 7 years before they had kids. She made all these choices. And when she stayed home, that was again her choice. And she had kids on her timing, and she had her career, and she did all these things. I remember being like 8 months pregnant with my third child. And she's on this bike ride from Canada to Mexico on a tandem bike with her husband. And they're passing through California where I live. And I'm like super pregnant with my third child. And I'm looking at them and I'm like, I'm not jealous. I am not jealous. I'm doing the right thing. I am the righteous person here. I am not jealous. My life is so much more fulfilling than hers because she's not doing the right thing. How could she possibly be happy doing these things? Because she's putting off children, and you can't be happy if you put off children. But she sure did look happy. It was really hard to not think that her life, she was still going to have children and do the things that I was doing, but she was going to have all those other experiences as well. So, it probably drove it home even harder to have my closest sibling living the life that I kind of had imagined, but had not done because I was following the program so closely. And she's like, I remember just recently we had a conversation. I was like, I was told that if I put off family, I would be selfish. And she's like, I guess I just didn't mind being seen as selfish. And I was like, that had not occurred to me that was an option to let people look down on me and think I was selfish. Like she had just been more resistant, and she hadn't gone to Institute and heard all these talks. I think there was something about Rick's College that kind of radicalized me, I would say, in the way that this was the only way. It kind of drove me to get married young and like take all this really seriously in a way that she hadn't. She also was someone who, though, had not dated a lot. So like we were pretty similar to that point in our lives. And then I went deep into the church program, and she stayed on the edge of it and maintained her individuality. And it just made a huge difference. It still does. To this day, she's more likely to be able to just do adventures and all sorts of things.
And so as you think about, maybe let's just say those last 5 years and when things really reached a breaking point, how did this affect you over time? How did this affect you over time in terms of like wearing you down, taking you to a really low point? Talk about sort of how this wore on you over time to the point where you reached your breaking point. Do you remember kind of descending to a low point and then hitting rock bottom? And I mean, in terms of your depression or your self-worth or your lack of contentment, what did that look like?
Well, I started at a really low point with, postpartum depression. So, it was kind of like I had this really rough transition into like marriage. I felt like we were the first year and a half of our marriage, we were fairly equal. We were both working, making about the same amount of money, trying to go to school. But having the baby changed everything as far as putting me into a strict gender role. And I, had this nightmare of a first year as far as just feeling worthless and unprepared for this life ahead of me. Then things got better, but I always just struggled with routine. Getting my scriptures read every day was a struggle, and praying regularly was a struggle, not because I didn't believe in it, but just because I just resist. I resist all kinds of routine. I can't get a job chart to do more than 2 days. We've just struggled. And I learned one of my kids that when they were in school, they got diagnosed with ADD because the teacher was like, I can never tell if he's really listening. And he's sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. And I've talked to his teacher last year, and I realized, oh, wait, this isn't normal to be so like scatterbrained. I just thought that was just a family trait, and maybe something can be done. And, finding out that he had ADD, realizing I had ADD, and that, oh, maybe I can take medication. And suddenly, finally, I'll be able to get my visiting teaching done, get my scriptures read. I'll be able to finally check off all the things on this list, and then I'll have it together, and then I'll be happy. Because the problem is that I'm just not good enough. Like all of this time, I would be happy if I could just follow the program, but I'm too lazy. I'm too distracted. I can't get all the things done. And that's why I struggle, because I'm not getting the things done. I know the way to happiness. I just can't make it happen. And so the whole time it was just me not really measuring up. So then I get on medication and I'm still scatterbrained, and I'm still, it improved. And I realize I'm just the way I am. I can't change my brain. There's no, God made me this way. And this was like right after Prop 8, and I lived in California during Prop 8, and realizing that I'd sat here and judged people for not being able to change their brains. And here I am with this brain that can't be changed, and how at least my brain is acceptable. People will accept that I have this issue, and luckily I'm an artist, I'm creative, and people will just be like, well, that's how she is. But nobody's giving that kind of latitude to the gay people that we were just campaigning against, and realizing that sometimes you can't just willpower and become something that you're not. And it was kind of a breakdown, but also a breakthrough, I would say, because I realized that I just am who I am. And I had this moment, I'd been so low, like I can't do the program. I'm unhappy because I'm just not enough. And kind of had this moment of, I would say, grace, where I felt like I actually kind of got in touch with God, who was like, you were made this way and you're different for a reason. And you're like, this also, we got a dog about this time, and we were looking at different breeds, and they'd say, oh, this one has a lot of energy and needs to run a lot. This one sleeps 23 hours a day. And it's not like this dog is better than this dog. I'm like, I'm a sleepy dog. It's fine that genetically, it doesn't matter how much I hate myself. I'm not going to turn into the energetic, list-oriented, person. I have my own strengths. I have my own abilities that someone, on that side doesn't have, because I'm just bred like a lazy dog. But I'm loyal and I'm fun, and I have my own strengths. We're not judging dogs for their energy level, but we do that with humans. And so it kind of just was like, I can't change this. And learning to have to accept that kind of changed something for me, and made me realize that all of these checklists were hurting me, and they were making me feel like a failure so much of the time. And so I kind of had this breakthrough where I was like, you know what? There's 2 commandments, love God and love your neighbor. And I'll just focus on that. And I will do that. And so I felt really good for a little while.
So that awakening was around what year?
Probably 2009.
Okay. A year after
10.
Prop 8.
Actually, it was probably, let's see, we moved in 2013. It was probably 2011.
Okay. It's about 9 years ago.
Yeah. At that point, so right before this breakthrough, like all of this kind of happened. I'd felt for years just like not enough, and exhausted by all the checklists, and just not enough ever. But at this time, I also was working as a photographer. I started my own business. I'm trying to raise 4 kids and run this business. And, Dave couldn't help because his job is to do his job, not my job. So I had to fit anything I could do without his help. So, yeah, it was just exhausting. And I got to a point, I guess I kind of skipped that, just got to a point where I couldn't do it. I just couldn't I was like, I can't do this photography business. It's either or. I can't do this business and have the kids and do my visiting teaching and do my calling. And like, I couldn't do it. So I was like, something's got to go. And I started seeing a therapist and I got on the medication. And that's kind of where this breakthrough happened. So that was one breakthrough. Like, I'm okay. I can't change myself. I'm going to have to just accept myself. So that was a beautiful thing, to just learn to accept myself. The other one, I would say the other breakthrough was when I was in therapy, after feeling like either I've got to leave my family and just run away, or I've got to, sorry, my husband was about to get a job and then it fell through. I thought if we could just leave California, we were living in the Bay Area in this small house. I was like, I could just start over and everything would be okay. And then he ended up getting another job in the Bay Area. And I was like, oh, I'm not going to be able to run away from this. I'm not going to be able to just start over. I'm going to have to actually make it through this and fix whatever is bringing me down. And so that's when I was like, I have to go to therapy because I can't continue. Either I'm going to leave, divorce the family. It was too much weight. I couldn't do all the things. And I felt tired of being depressed and overwhelmed and sad. And that's when I went to therapy. That's when I got on medication. That's when things started to change.
2012? What?
Yeah, 2011, okay. I'd say.
Yeah, and I guess as I'm trying to think about how I would answer this question to build understanding and empathy, like, if the church is true, then yeah, we sacrifice everything.
Right.
But then also, if the church truly makes you happy and it's true, well then, yeah, nothing matters, because you do it because it's true, but also because it's going to make you happy.
Right.
And then if you're sacrificing things or you're not living a certain path that you might be able to live, well, that's fine, because you're following God's law and you're going to be happy.
And any sacrifice is worth it.
Right.
It'll make you happier.
But what happens, and I've known mothers like this, where they make all these decisions. They don't pursue the education they want. They don't pursue the career that they may want. They don't have the fun that they may want. They don't necessarily marry the person that they might really connect with well. Then they start having the kids early, and then they get super depressed and unhappy. And so they're not happy. They're depressed. They're feeling awful all the time. And they've got all these kids they're responsible for. And then like, oh, what if you find out it's not true?
Right. And you love these kids. You're not going to, like, you're too deep at that point. And I remember having probably about the same time as I was like, I'm changing the diaper of my third kid and I should be backpacking in Europe right now. I remember feeling like, I just don't think I'm that spiritual. The church, I'm not sure the church is true. But then being like, I can't do this by myself. I can't let him know that, like, that I'm doubting it all, because if he leaves me,
and we'll get to that.
This is way worse. So I never actually even went down that path. Sure. I remember having a flicker of like, what if this isn't true?
Right.
But it's like, nope.
Yeah.
Nope. I can't even go there.
And the best way I'm thinking to communicate the injustice, as if it needs to be justified or communicated, if you were to like go to McDonald's and be given a burger or chicken nuggets, and you find out that it's not really cow, right? It's like horse meat. Mm-hmm. Or the chicken nuggets aren't really chicken. There's some sort of synthetic chemical blend. Ew. Like, that's just one meal, right? And you're outraged. Mm-hmm. Or you go to buy, let's take something a little bit more severe. You go to buy a car, and you think you're buying this car that's, well taken care of, well maintained. You look at the title, there's no crashes, the mileage is so-and-so. Then you come to find out later, oh, wait, they changed the mileage and it has been wrecked, and they scrubbed the title, and the car is a lemon, right? Mm-hmm. Okay, well, that's a $10,000 or $20,000 investment. Okay, now it's not just a cheeseburger or some nuggets. This is like a major investment, and you were betrayed. I mean,
it's your whole freaking life.
Yeah, that's where I'm going. So, I mean, so when When it's just like chicken nuggets or a burger or a car, you have the right to sue. You have the right to be outraged. But what if it's your life? What if it's your education? What if it's your career? What if it's who you marry, when you marry, how you marry, how much fun you didn't or did have, how many kids you did or didn't have when you had them? What if it's 30 years of your life that you followed a path under a certain set of expectations with a certain set of promises, with the understanding that it would make you happy, and then it doesn't? It's not consent. It's a non-consensual arrangement where you were misled and you made the most valuable decisions you could ever make are how to spend your time and your money and your resources and your identity. There's nothing else that matters, really. And so you're taking the most valuable things you have, which is your time, your money, your identity, and your life.
Yeah.
And you're giving it to a cause with the expectation that you'll get, number one, that it's true, and number two, that it'll make you happy. And it doesn't. Like what else?
There were certain things that made me happy.
Yeah.
Friends, community. But again, the church doesn't own that.
No.
They take credit for it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had put everything into this equation and said, if A, then B equals C. And I had done it because it was true. It's not if God's demanding, that's because that's how God is. Period.
Yeah.
If it's true, you make any sacrifice that you have to because it's true. You don't get to argue that.
Yeah.
You know better than God. You don't get to argue how God should be. So if it's true, it's worth any sacrifice you follow no matter what.
Yeah.
Period.
Yeah. And so you have this beautiful awakening where you're like, I'm just going to accept myself. I'm a dog. I mean, it's awful. You're like, oh, I'm happy with that analogy.
And hating myself for being a hound dog won't turn me into a chihuahua that just bounces all the time, right?
Yeah, but I mean, you're thinking yourself
the analogy
as a dog.
helped.
But anyway, you come to this moment of self-acceptance, of therapy, but none of that's on plan. Because according to the church, the plan isn't go to a therapist and then just accept your flaws.
Right.
The church's plan is read your scriptures, pray, serve, lose yourself.
Yeah.
Keep being uber faithful, be on that hamster wheel of worthiness, and you'll find happiness. So you kind of, when you go to a therapist, when you accept your imperfections and that you're a dog, you're actually off plan at that point.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. But that's because I couldn't do the plan and in that way, being unable to had turned into a gift. It had been a curse for so long.
Yeah.
And my friends that are better at getting things done and have more of the checklist accomplished, they're still there because they feel like they're just on the verge of getting there.
Yeah.
I wasn't even close. Like I was trying so hard and just being such a failure all the time that after 15 years, I just had nothing left to give. And I was depleted to my bones.
And honestly, you're kind of a best case scenario because the dark side of this is with a little bit of a different personality or set of experiences. There are women that get depressed. There are women that become suicidal. There are women who leave their husbands. Some have affairs. Some just leave. Some self-destruct. And I have family members close to me where the woman just checked out and just left the husband with kids, and had a few years of spiraling. And it's great that you found a way to make it work because when it doesn't work, it can unravel catastrophically. Well, and it's not just you. It's not just the woman that gets hurt, which is enough.
Right.
It's the spouse and the children and lots of other people.
Well, and those are the expected outcomes. When you're in the church, it's like if you let go, that's what's going to happen. And it does happen occasionally. And that's why that illustration is powerful and works because you do see people whose everything falls apart. And that happens to some people. And so, for me, luckily it didn't. And we had enough behind as much as I've made Dave sound like a villain here, he's not. We actually he's hilarious and we have so much fun together. It's just that these gender roles were killing us and killing our relationship.
Right.
And so luckily we still had enough there that, even behind all my resentment, I still liked him as a person. I just hated that he didn't help.
Yeah.
And I hated that, it was all on me. I remember sitting in a pew at church and the kids were making noise and he looked at me and told me to tell them to be quiet. And I was like, you're right here. But that's how deep our gender roles had gone. And he was looking ahead to being, he was a good Mormon man doing the program as expected as well. He was living up to his expectations, which were really onerous as well. He'd spend 7 hours a week on Sunday at church. He'd go to work for a full day. He'd have one day off on Saturday and then he'd be at church all day as well. So, his life wasn't all that fun either. But yeah, in a way, being unable to do the program well enough ended up being a gift for me.
Right. That
broke me down so hard that I had no choice but to find another way.
So we're at 2011, 2012, where you've seen a therapist, you're on depression meds, and you just accept yourself as a hound dog Mormon woman.
Yeah.
Take us from that to the point where you start questioning your faith.
Okay. So I remember as I'm starting to get better, one day I'm talking to my therapist, and I was like, there's this thing I want to do with my business, and, but I can't because Dave won't let me. And she's like, well, what if you did it anyway? And I was like, well, he'd be upset. And she's like, what would that look like? Well, he'd sulk and he'd just be annoyed. And she's like, why can't he be upset? That's a normal thing. Like, are you serious? He never gets upset. You don't let him be upset. And I remember just that question blowing my mind. Why can't he be upset? Why do I feel like it's my job to keep him happy all the time? That he can't ever be disappointed in any of my choices, or that I can never assert myself in any situation. What is that? And, I started realizing, that's because this is the programming. I've been taught that I need to watch out for making sure that the boys don't think certain things, and I'm supposed to be a helpmate. And so I started becoming more and more sensitive to these messages that would make me feel small, that I was using to make myself small. So once I'd had this moment of grace where I'm like, look, you're just going to have to be who you are because that's all you can be, I started noticing all the ways that when we're told to be small, but also big. You're not supposed to have wants and desires, but you're supposed to do all you can to make everyone else's, work really hard and have the best house and the most beautiful family and, do all these things, work really hard, but also be humble and don't have ambition. So it's put on the gas and the brake at the same time in the right way. So I just started being why am I the only one that gets to feel bad feelings? And it was a real interesting adjustment in our marriage when, I would say something and he would use the old tactics that would work, try to guilt trip me or tell me that he didn't like that. And I would just say, well, I guess you're just going to have to be disappointed. And suddenly he's like, wait, what? And he would have to sit with his disappointment and be like, oh, it's fine. She can do her thing, And so I started finding a voice, which meant that he had to listen more, which at first was kind of a shock to him because I had been this compliant, quiet, just beating myself up the whole time in order to make myself fit. And suddenly I'm like, no, excuse me, no. And he was like, wait, what? And the more I was honest and allowing him to be more upset, the more he considered what I would want. And it actually made our marriage so much better because he suddenly started seeing me as a more of a full person. We were still in this paradigm, but something had switched to where I was like, no, being a woman I can't help myself. I am who I am. And God made me this way, and God loves everyone. And therefore, we're all fine, including those gay people that we were just persecuting. That had felt really wrong and really weird. I had actually even gone out. They told me that I needed to do a route and go door to door and start talking to people. And the whole thing felt so weird. I did go out one day and try to canvass for Prop 8. And I just, again, was beating myself down to say, you have to obey before you get the confirmation that it's right? You have to do the thing, and then your testimony will grow. So I did the thing, voted the way they told me to. And
you
then
were living where during Prop 8?
San Jose.
Oh, okay.
California.
Yeah.
So I was someone that voted the way that they had told me to. And I didn't feel good about it later. And I felt really bad about that for a long time and thought, and then when I get diagnosed with ADD a couple years later, I'm like, they can't help it. Their brain is built the way it is, just like mine is built the way it is. Luckily, nobody's persecuting me for my brain. But, sometimes some things you just can't fix. Some things you just can't willpower your way through. So I started to really understand that God made us how we are, and it's not, we are fine the way we are. But I became more and more aware of the messages that told us we weren't fine, and realizing, oh, that's the poison. Oh, that's the thing that I've been using. And so as time went on, watching more and more people swallowing this became more and more difficult. So after we moved to Reno in 2013, I would say things started to accelerate as far as me noticing how many messages. And this is about the time Kate Kelly starts making some noise, and I'm like, yeah, women should be given voices. Like in my life, getting a voice has been so much better for us. And women do have ideas. Women are important. I started to find my value as a woman. And
how did it improve your marriage for your marriage to become more equal? I mean, it may be obvious. Like, I'm guessing you were happier.
Yeah.
How was it better for the marriage?
Well, he also felt happier just because I was more alive, and I was more of a partner and less of a sad sack, just overwhelmed and, tired all the time.
You were less depressed and sad.
And so I became more of a person that he'd want to be around, just because I was suddenly like, I'm not going to beat myself up about visiting teaching anymore. It's not serving me. I can love my neighbor as much as I can, and I'll love them as well as I can, but I can't do the checklist. Forget the checklist. And when I threw away the checklist, there was less of a burden on me. And so in that way, I feel like I became more pleasant. But in another way, it was just, he had to step up, and he felt more involved and more connected when he had to do more. Like, he didn't just get to keep all of his views outside on work. He sometimes had to look at home, and it kind of helped him be more of a presence in our lives as well. And that made him happy, because family life is great, especially when you actually love each other and when you're not frustrated and fighting all the time. So in that way, that began to really just, even before issues of church stuff came up, I would say I had this feminist awakening in about 2011, just kind of that I do have worth. And then that built over time to where in 2013, when we moved to Reno, I started to really become say, I think I might be a feminist. Like, that word was so bad, but I started to become to identify that, no, women, we are really undercutting women, and we need to I was still in the program, but saying we need to push up women a little better.
So, husbands, if you support a more equal marriage, your wife will be happier. So she won't be as depressed, and you'll be around someone who isn't as grouchy and depressed and who's happier, has more energy. You will become a more involved part of the family, probably closer to the kids. That's all good. Mm-hmm. What about your relationship with him, your intimacy together? And I know Mormons think when you say intimacy, you mean sex, but I'm just talking about intimacy, your connection, connectedness as a couple. Did that improve?
it did improve, but I would say to a point, because we still had, these certain things that we couldn't talk about. I couldn't really criticize the feminist, the ways that the church didn't serve women and the ways it made them smaller. So I would say it was a 50% improvement.
In the relationship.
Just, accepting myself as I was and finding this, like, throwing away the checklist and being like, well, I guess I'm a hound dog.
Right.
I'm not a Chihuahua. So I guess I just am who I am, and I'm just going to have to accept that. So I would say, and, realizing that he could be upset, those couple things improved it, I would say, about 50%.
Okay. There's still a ways to go.
Yeah, just because, again, he's still presiding.
Yeah.
And I'm still pushing him to preside. I'm still trying to be in second place, but maybe just like right behind him instead of like sitting in the back seat while he drives.
Okay.
I was maybe in the passenger seat a little more and offering direction now and then.
Right.
So it was an improvement, but we still had
a ways to go
to leave the church in order to really feel true equality.
So Kate Kelly, Kate Kelly and I, that kind of happens in 2014.
Mm-hmm.
The ordained women, Kate Kelly's excommunicated in 2014. I don't even know if you'd heard of me yet, but
Mm-hmm.
Kate Kelly's excommunicated in 2014. I'm excommunicated in 2015. How did your journey proceed? Did you start getting into Mormon history stuff? Or?
So I would say my real journey started with feminism, what I'm saying, just starting to feel like, what, I am a person. And why did I feel like I wasn't a person? And then and I felt like a person as a kid, and then realizing, wait a minute, it was the temple, starting to realize that some of this programming had really done this damage to me. I was aware of, I remember, it kind of feels like right after we moved to Reno, I remember hearing some podcast about middle way Mormonism, and I was like, yes, that's what I want. I want to be a middle way Mormon, and have nuance and all of these things. I felt really empowered for a little while and thought, I can do this. And, it's going to be the most beautiful, wonderful type of Mormonism. But yeah, Kate Kelly's excommunication kind of put a big damper on feeling like there was room for women to make improvements.
For feminists in the church, right?
Yeah, it was just like, maybe our voices aren't important. And maybe, the temple, that's an issue because these are our vows. And so then I started having a problem with the temple, realizing how deeply that had affected the way I saw myself and the way that it made gender dynamics on steroids in our marriage. It just completely put us in these inflexible roles where I felt small and he felt big. And what I wanted didn't matter as much as what he wanted. And so I realized the temple had a big part of that. And then I started learning the history of the temple and realized, actually, I remember early, right after we moved to Reno, Dave and I had this conversation, and he mentioned polygamy or something and said, who knows, maybe it'll be in heaven. And now that I had gone to therapy and had started to be able to identify my feelings, I felt this like inner rage. And in the past, I would be like, stop it, stop thinking about it. I would like somehow put it off. But for me, at that moment, I sat with it. I'm like, why does him having polygamy in heaven make me feel rage? And I realized in heaven, we're not partners anymore. Like here, we're partners. And he's like, in heaven, we'll still be partners, but I guess maybe there'll be more people there. And suddenly I was like, no, I'm on the sidelines in this heaven.
In Mormon heaven. Right?
In Mormon heaven.
Yeah.
Where if there's polygamy, I'm suddenly on the sidelines and you're in the center. And I know you've always been in the center, but suddenly that's just not heaven to me. Like, even if the thought of sharing him was one thing, but the thought of being demoted was what really bothered me, from partner to I don't even know what you are when, I'm like, and I was trying to explain it. I'm like, right now we're 50-50. Then I become like 10% and you become 90%. You're like this wheel and I'm just one of the spokes and you're the center. And I suddenly become even less in this equation. And this heaven doesn't seem that great to me. So yeah, polygamy started to really bother me in a way that I had just kind of pushed it away before. Because I was like, when it just is a way that proves that women are only a fraction of the value of men. And so that started to bother me. So
a lot of Orthodox Mormon women just say, "Oh, polygamy is something we did a long time ago. We don't do it anymore." They don't even, like, to them, polygamy is not a reality. Why by this point are you somehow thinking that polygamy might still be in effect when an Orthodox Mormon is just going to say, "Oh, we stopped that 100 years ago"?
Well, for a couple of reasons. Any woman that I'd talked to about polygamy as a believing Mormon, we all felt weird about it. Nobody was comfortable with the idea. And I would tell myself, well, that's because it's not okay. But, if it was not against the law, I'd probably be okay with it. And on some level, it freaked me out realizing that the way I had pushed myself to get married, had polygamy been a real thing, I probably would have pushed myself into being polygamous. Like the way I had forced myself into the program, I would have done the same thing had that been real. So it kind of freaked me out. But it is part of Mormon theology still. It's in heaven. I wasn't saying if it comes back, I'll be uncomfortable with it. It's there in the future. It's still there. He was still saying, well, okay, I wouldn't do that, but it's still part of the theology.
It's in D&C 132.
Yeah. It's never been disavowed.
It's doctrine.
It's still in the temple. Our prophet has, polygamy already in heaven. He believes he's sealed to 2 women.
Both Dallin H. Oaks and Russell M. Nelson are sealed to multiple women in heaven. And that's their Mormon prophets today. So Mormons still believe in polygamy. Mormon women, I have news for you. You are in a polygamist religion, and you will likely be sharing your husband with other women. Go read the D&C 132. Look at the marriage of your prophet and the second in charge. We're a polygamous church still. We are.
It's not in the past. It's in the future. It's in the past as well and in the future. It's just not current. And women are like, oh, I'm so glad it's not current. But it is this ghost, in the future. It does hang over your head. It's not been disavowed. They're not saying it's not going to be in heaven. Yeah. Nobody's saying that. No. It's still there. And everyone's a little freaked out by it.
Yeah. And please, this is a plug for Carolyn Pearson's book, The Ghost of Eternal Polygamy. It's an amazing book. It's still affecting women and men today in Mormonism. Check out that book. Check out my podcast. It's worth checking out. So how did things continue? So the temple domino falls, the polygamy domino falls.
Yeah.
What other dominoes fall?
Well, so I actually remember one of the last times I went to the temple. So my grandma, she actually did my initiatory for me, which was really uncomfortable, by the way, being under a sheet, having never been naked anywhere, and here's my grandma touching my body, which was better that it was my grandma in some ways, but the whole thing was just really freaky. But my grandma had made me this beautiful apron, and I was so proud. Every time I went to the temple, it was hand-stitched and embroidered, all the leaves, the green, and it was just so beautiful. And I remember being at the temple, having learned the history of the temple, realizing that women were pretty much allowed to be part of the temple ceremony in order to get Emma to acquiesce to polygamy. He's like, well, you've got to be the elect lady. And in order to be the elect lady who passes around these signs and tokens, you have to accept polygamy. And so she did for a little while so that she could get her endowments, basically. And realizing that had been a tool to make polygamy more palatable to women, it grossed me out. But so I remember one of the last...
Where can someone read about that? Someone who doesn't know that.
I remember somebody wrote an article, I think it's on Feminist Mormon Housewives, about Mormon priestess. And it kind of goes over but the history So the endowment, you can see that the polygamy in the Mormon Priestess article. She kind of shows that, basically your husband. What I was saying that I had
part about
picked up.
Joseph using the endowment to manipulate Emma, or allowing Emma to be a part of it as a way to manipulate her.
I believe that's in Mormon Enigma.
Okay, Mormon Enigma.
Yeah, I think that's in there, and I think you can find it in your polygamy for sure. And Lindsay Hansen Park's podcast, amazing. Definitely go listen to that. But yeah, realizing that women were manipulated by the temple in order to accept polygamy, and in order to justify polygamy, and then to be in the temple and to be second to my husband, and this is the highest truth I can have, and it became really difficult. And I remember sitting in the temple with my beautiful apron from my grandma, who loved the church more than anything, and saying, thinking to my grandma, if I'm wrong, please let me know. Like, I'm in the temple, you're on the other side. I'm playing with my damnation here. Show up, please, and let me know. I have this talisman, that she had made. And I thought if there's a time that anyone can come to the temple and reveal themselves to me, Grandma would do it right now. And she didn't, So it's just like, she's not there. She's not the temple. She's not here in the temple trying to get to me on the other side like I've been taught, like I'd hoped, So that was just another chink in the armor where I was just like, the temple's disgusting. It's a tool of control to keep me paying tithing, to keep me following the word of wisdom, because if I don't do this, I risk losing my family. The temple, it became very clear to me that it was a tool of control. And yeah, that was one of the big things to go.
Yeah, totally. Okay. So the temple falls, polygamy falls, patriarchy starts falling. What's next?
I think I guess the history, finding the true history.
How did you start getting into that?
So for me, the history, I could have accepted the history if the current church hadn't been problematic. So I would say, the gay thing, the feminist thing, I read the Blacks in the Priesthood essay and being like, oh my gosh, they were teaching this as doctrine and now they're saying it's not. That one was really...
the Race in the Priesthood.
The Race in the Priesthood, yeah.
Gospel Topics essay.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That was really eye-opening for them. They were teaching it as doctrine, like deep doctrine. They're saying this is doctrine. And we can't change it because, truth is truth. God is God. You don't get to advise God. And then several years later to turn that around and say... Oh, no.
Opinions of men.
They were just opinions. So that was really upsetting. But yeah, I felt like the history could have been what it is, and I would have been fine with it. But also the current church was problematic as well. And it had done real damage to me personally. And as I sat in wards, I would hear women being damaged every week. Because, certain people can say, well, I reject that. That's, I don't believe that. And that's fine for them. And that's a healthy way to be able to approach the church. But I wasn't doing that. And I knew there were other women there drinking those without reservation. They weren't saying, should I drink this or not? Is this good for me or not? They were saying, well, you said I should drink it, so I will. The most healthy women are the ones that can say, well, that one doesn't apply to me. But I never did that. I never said that doesn't apply to me. I said, did the prophet say it? Yes. Well, then it applies to me. And so, I also had a friend at the time who lived in San Jose. And I remember we were in Relief Society and somebody said something about gays and we both stiffened up. And then we both looked at each other like, I just saw you flinch. And so, we started talking about some things. And she was actually much farther along, like intellectually, than I had been. So she we would go on walks for hours shout out Anna, you're the best. We would just go for walks for hours and, kind of discuss feminism and polygamy and, really deep dive into all this stuff. So it was so nice to have someone to do this with, to help hold my hand as I went through this. I mean, it's really painful to deconstruct your life. As much as it's freeing, it's also devastating. So, it was really nice to have that, but it was also really hard to do. And I lost a lot of friends who were really uncomfortable with, me even having problems. For me to even say, hey, did you know this about the history? And I was trying really hard not to say stuff that would challenge people's testimony, because I could see very quickly that didn't work. But the more I sat in meetings, the more feminist I became, the more I saw the church fighting against feminists and LGBT people who could not change their brains, the more I was just like, this hurts people, not just me. It hurts the gay people. It hurts the people of color who've been taught that they're somehow also less than. It hurts women. It hurts, it actually hurts men as well. It hurt Dave, who was doing the program as well as he could. He was overwhelmed. He had a wife who resented him half the time because he was doing his part. So, it doesn't serve anybody. So then the last thing for me to fall was community. I remember sitting in Relief Society and being like, well, I'm here for the community. It's good. Either it's true, you'll stay because it's true, or you'll stay because it's good, or both. But if it's neither, there's nothing left. And I got to the point where I was like, it's not true, and it's not even good. And I can't make a difference in this community because I'm sitting here in Relief Society among all these women who I love. But if I spoke up right now and said the things I know, they would not want me here. And it also kills me to sit here and hear these poisons and not protect them. So part of me needs to stand up. I would tell people that I was a dragon. I was, I had this fire, and if I breathe it on them, they're going to get burned. If I swallow it, I'm going to get burned. It just became every week I'd go to church, and then I'd stew and be angry for the whole week. And, and then Sunday would come around and I'd try it again and have to spend the whole week recovering because it was just so hard to see the damage that was being done every week to certain people. Everyone on some level, except maybe the very top leaders. But
and so as you're really going down the rabbit hole, are you able to talk to your husband about this? Is he going with you? Is he remaining a believer? Are you going through this alone? Do you have other people to talk to? I know that Steve, my friend, your brother, was, he and Mindy were going through some stuff too. Mm-hmm. Did you have family members you could go through this with?
No. So turns out Steve and Mindy and I were doing this all at the same time. We didn't know. Because
no one feels comfortable telling it.
Right. And once you out yourself, you're sidelined. You're not going to get a good calling. You're going to be stuck on the sidelines forever as soon as somebody knows that you've spoken up about something. So it becomes this kind of deep, dark secret for a while. Dave was not on board at first. I mean, he was on board with me becoming more myself, and he was on board with becoming more equal, but he was not on board with bringing down the church, losing my testimony. He was trying to help me out. And actually, my son, he was a senior at the end of this his junior senior year. I remember him being like, "Mom, let's read scriptures together." And I was like, okay. So, because I wanted to support him trying to help me, even though I knew it wasn't going to happen. And I wasn't trying to bring the kids out either, because I was respecting Dave's wishes to stay Mormon. But he tries to do this scripture study, and we get to this verse in the Book of Mormon about brown skin being a curse. And he's like, so, what did you think about that chapter? And I'm like, what do you think about cursing people with skin color? And he's like, are you saying the Book of Mormon's racist? And I was like, I didn't say that, but it sure looks like it. And that was the last time he read scriptures with me. But Dave, I was saying the church expands men. It makes them into gods. Like without the church, you're just a regular dude. Like, that's kind of sad to give up being a god and just become a mortal. And so I think for him, it was harder to give up this extra source of validation at the church. Whereas I wasn't getting any validation. I was only feeling crappy. So
you were trading up, he'd be trading down.
Exactly.
Or at least it seemed that way.
I was being released and he was being demoted.
Also, you're gaining power and he would be losing power.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and he was willing to give me some, but I wasn't going to take his godhood away. And actually, at some point there, I remember I had a conversation with him where I was like, Dave, I know we had this agreement where we're going to do Mormonism and we're going to the temple and we're going to be sealed for eternity. And I know you still believe that sealings are for eternity, and I release you. If you need to get a wife that can be your eternal companion and who will also believe that this is a thing, I release you. Like, this was our agreement. You were going to do this with me. And I was the good girl. And I haven't lived up to the agreement we made because I'm not a good girl anymore. I was not a bad girl, but I was not believing. And I could not wear the garment, knowing the history of it. I couldn't abide that. And so,
how did it feel to take off your garments and to wear just regular underwear?
So relieving.
Why?
I felt like it was like one of those dog collars. It made me, it reduced what I could wear. It made me feel ugly and unbeautiful. Like wearing regular underwear and being able to wear whatever clothes fit the weather. I just felt so much more beautiful, more in touch with my body, more like myself. I was wearing the same underwear as my grandma when I was 21. I remember I took care of my grandma the last couple years of her life, and I was like, we are wearing the same underwear. It's so gross. And I was wearing that underwear before I ever got married, before I was ever a sexual being, I was always fully clothed. Because that underwear, you are fully clothed in that underwear. I was never sexy, ever.
Are you saying garments impede healthy sexuality?
I feel like we had a healthy sex life, but I didn't feel sexy. You know what I mean? I didn't feel like, as a woman, unless I was having sex, I didn't feel sexy. I didn't feel beautiful. I felt basically, embarrassed. You're always pulling things to hide your garments. If you bend over and your garments are showing, you're always tucking and pulling and hiding these garments. And suddenly I just felt so much freer to just not have this embarrassing thing. It's embarrassing to have these weird underwear if somebody sees them. At the gym, I'd be more embarrassed to be seen in my garments than I would be to be naked. It was embarrassing. Yeah. So it felt really freeing to stop wearing the garments. So with Dave, when I was like, you're free, and he's like, well, whoa, he's like, I want you. And he was like, even at this time as a believer, he's like, well, if she's going to hell, I'm going with her. He chose me. And that kind of, it healed this doubt that I'd had that he liked me as a person rather than me as a good girl. So yeah, he was like, well, I guess I'll go to hell with you. And there was this, so that was about 6 months. That was the summer. I took off the garments during the summer.
What year?
2015.
So 5 years ago.
Yeah. because our 20th anniversary was that December. And so 6 months after I'd taken off garments, he was still believing. We went to Cancun on our 20th anniversary trip. And I was like, Dave, I'm going to order alcohol. It's free here. I'm going to get alcohol. And because I had lost all belief. I'm like, the word of what I'd done the history. I had to deconstruct it. It had been so deep into me that I had to do all the history research to be like, well, the word of wisdom came from this. And, just all of the things I deconstructed. Was it
books? Was it podcasts? What were your main sources of deconstructing things?
Yeah, lots of podcasts, books.
Which
Mormon
podcasts?
Stories.
Which books?
Okay, Mormon Stories. I loved John Larson eventually once I got over
Mormon
the swears.
Expression.
Yeah.
What Mormon Stories episodes were really important for you? Just so listeners can maybe go check out a few that were really meaningful to you.
I remember one of the first ones I listened to is Benji Schwimmer.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just so genuine, and like the part where basically the spirit tells him to leave. It was just so touching. And, I just like how much struggle. I mean, I felt like I had struggled as well, feeling less than, but he had struggled, also being not enough.
Yeah.
And so my struggle was different, but similar. And so that one really touched me. Like Jeremy Reynolds, I think that one came out as I was not believing. I don't remember what year that was, but I don't think that was a huge surprise to me. I was reading Mormon Enigma. I listened to your polygamy podcast, which we already mentioned, Lindsay Hansen Park, You're the Best. Just that one helped me, first of all, relate to the women in Mormon history who are so often erased, and then also to understand this horrible dynamic. About that same time, I actually went to the Beehive House on a visit with my mom and my sister, and they had talked about Brigham Young as if he was monogamous. Like, here's his wife's room, and here's his room, and here's their family. And I almost went off on these little missionaries from some other country and was like, are you kidding me? But yeah, I just was like, they whitewash everything. Everything that I thought it was is not. I can't even, it's been a while and my memory is bad, first of all, but I feel like I devoured everything I could get my hands on. Anything I could. Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry.
That's good. So you go down the rabbit hole. Your husband says, I love you anyway.
Yeah. We go to Cancun. I order alcohol. He takes a sip.
Wait, are you an alcoholic now?
No.
What?
In fact, most days, most weeks, I don't even drink. Like, yeah, I thought it was going to be, that's another thing, like sex, that I thought would be so powerful. And was just like, okay, it's nice. It was not so powerful. It was just nice. But he, so I ordered this alcohol and he ordered a drink too. And that was the most romantic thing he had ever done in his life, because I was like, now he's really going to hell in his belief. Like, I can't believe he's actually following me on this path. Like, he actually does love me as a person, not me as a helpmeet, me as a good girl, me as the person he's dating almost a year after his mission who would make a decent wife. You know, it just, it switched something really beautiful to be like, okay, actually he loves me. It just made me feel so much more secure in our marriage, knowing that he was there for me, not for my role. So
was it a more romantic getaway?
Yes. It was amazing. And it's one of the happiest memories of my life. Just those days of really, it felt like a rebirth, you know, like he loved me, and like in a way that I did not know. So it was, it healed a lot of the resentment that had built up for so many years, feeling like I didn't matter to him, and that turns out it wasn't that I didn't matter. It was just that these things were getting in the way. And that he truly did love me and was willing to go wherever, and that our family was going to be fine, and that it just kind of took out this barrier that had been there for 20 years. Suddenly I was like, okay, he actually loves me. And so that kind of started him, once he's drank, he was like, well, I guess I'm on this path now. And he started to become more willing to listen to more of the details about, the problems. I was feeding him little things. It's not like I done all my research and then threw it at him all of a sudden. I was pretty honest, like, ugh, this is a problem. Ugh, this is a problem. And he would still just kind of be like, well, I think we can, I think there's answers. But, once he started, the more comfortable he could see that I wasn't going to lose control and, become an alcoholic and
cheat on him and run
cheating.
away.
Yeah, like I'd taken off the garments and I hadn't cheated. I started drinking and I hadn't become an alcoholic. Like I was still the person he knew me to be, and that I was stable. In fact, I was enhanced. I was better. I was happier, healthier. And so I think he was able to see this actually might be a good thing. And so then he was more willing to start actually looking at the details. So I think it helped. I've said this so many times, but I think it helped that I was the one leaving first, because had the roles been reversed, first of all, I had enough resentment that I would have been like, well, forget you. And second of all, he's just more of like gung-ho person, and he would have probably run out of the church and I would have been too afraid to follow. So I really feel blessed that, I don't usually say blessed, but I feel really lucky that it was me that led the charge, because he could follow, and I'm not sure the way things had worked in our marriage that I would have followed him. So
it's a tad bit ironic, because we're taught that the Mormon plan of salvation is the great plan of happiness. Mm-hmm. And we're taught that wickedness never was happiness. And I don't think there's anything more wicked in Mormonism than to apostatize.
Right.
Or to take your spouse out of the church. You
right.
know? And so you're basically doing all the wrong things. You're doing all the right things, and you're depressed and miserable. You start doing all the wrong things, and you start getting super happy, and your marriage improves.
Right. That
math doesn't work.
As soon as I start doing the wrong things, I start feeling better. And the wrong things being like loving my neighbor rather than reading my scriptures. Right. So
loving yourself instead of suppressing yourself.
Instead of beating myself up all the time.
Yeah.
Like that. Somehow you can't love yourself while you're beating yourself up. Mm. Like accepting myself was just huge as far as taking the weight off of everything.
Yeah. Or going to a therapist instead of reading your scriptures. Right.
Right. And I remember Dave being like, well, are you reading your scriptures every day? Do you really think you should start seeing a therapist until you've done all the things? And I was like, Dave, I can't read my scriptures because I'm too depressed. Yeah. Like, I can't even focus on that. Yeah. I need, like, this is beyond reading and praying harder. And like, actually my first therapy appointment, they did some kind of evaluation and they're like, oh, we usually medicate at this number and you're way beyond that. And for some reason, I think for his accountant brain, I came home and I'm like, they said they medicated this. And I'm like, wait, double that? He was kind of like, oh. And he stopped like resisting therapy. It's like, oh, I see. This is really concerning. And I think actually that kind of opened him up to realizing that I was in trouble and he might lose me because of the depression, and that he'd rather take me broken than lose me. Mm. And so that kind of opened him up in a way that he hadn't been to accepting these changes that I was about to go through. And so that helped as well. And
I can imagine maybe his parents, and I don't know his parents, but like his family members watching this and saying, whoa, Shannon, you freaking took our son out of the church. If somebody were to say, how dare you take our son out of the church and cause him to lose his faith, what would your answer be?
So I never would have done that if there had been any possibility that it was true. So yeah, I wouldn't send him to damnation as well. But yeah, I'm sorry, but not sorry. Like, we're so much better now. And I would love to invite them to come along and to be as like happy and as relieved and as, you know, improved at communication. And like in every aspect, our life has improved from where we were. And so, yeah, he actually did make choices on his own to do what he wanted to do, which was the same thing that I wanted to do, luckily. But, yeah, I definitely did start. He would have probably continued to follow the program because it wasn't as hard for him, and he was fine with it, and he would have continued to do it had I not gotten to the point where it was killing me. Yeah. And that he had to choose me or the church, and he chose me. But, you know, it's funny. Another analogy that I thought about often when realizing how much the church had changed my relationship with God, I remember realizing that it was like if God was a fire, I was trying to feel the warmth of the fire, but there was someone between me and the fire. There was always a priesthood leader or my husband or someone that had to grant me access to the fire. And suddenly, once I, you know, was able to kind of think for myself, and I was suddenly able to plug into that fire on my own. And I didn't need anyone between me and God. And I could access my own worth and my own power, and I didn't need anyone else to tell me how worthy I was or not worthy. I didn't need a middleman. And again, that last time I went to the temple, I remember being like, so I used to come here and think I was like God and the church were the same. And now I'm here and I only feel the church. Like I could see that this was the church. This wasn't God. God's so much bigger than the church. And God can't be containerized into the form of a man. And God, you know, God's so much bigger than the church gives him credit for. So for me, it was like, I don't know if there's a God or not, but I know the Mormon God is not it.
Sure.
Like, and I'd done enough of the history to see that this was created, not revealed. That all these things you could trace to where they came from. You can trace the Book of Mormon to inspirational stories, to like other books and other beliefs about Native Americans that found their way into the Book of Mormon. You can find polygamy. You can find the temple. Like nothing is original in the church. And so I realized this is just completely man-made, and I had no worries after that point. Everyone as they leave, they're like, well, what if it's true? And if there was any doubt, I had to completely undo all of that and be like, there's no God worth worshiping that would force children into marriage. They would force any woman into a marriage. They would, say that, take even, the polygamy essay, the Nauvoo polygamy gospel topics essay, when that came out, I remember, being really, I was hoping, I'd heard it was going to come out, and I was hoping that because I was still attending, thinking that maybe things could change. I was hoping that they would say, we disavow this or something. But they placed all the blame on God and said, God commanded Joseph to do it. Joseph was just doing what he was told. And it really bothered me that they would make God into basically a rapist, coercing Joseph and these girls to do this thing they didn't want. And
with the angel and the flaming sword.
Yeah. So God's going to be...
Of all the things, I always say this, of all the things God could send an angel with the flaming sword down to enforce, it's not the enslavement of people of color.
Right, which is happening at this time.
Yeah.
He had the choice of polygamy or slavery, and he goes... to talk about polygamy.
It's not Hitler. It's not world wars. It's not famine. It's not genocide. You know, it's not like keeping the vote from women. There are all these things God could have intervened on. And it's forcing Joseph to have sex with 14-year-olds. That's
right.
What God sends an angel with a flaming sword down to enforce.
Right.
Something wrong with that.
Right. And even Joseph's, according to that essay, even Joseph's agency was not being respected. Because they're like, oh, he was reluctant, but he just had to.
Poor guy.
I know. And I'm like, any God that's going to force young girls to marry an older man who they do not want to be. I feel like some of them did. I feel like Eliza R. Snow was totally down.
She did too.
And I have no problem if they actually wanted this. But especially the younger girls, did not want to be in these marriages. And a God that would do that is not worth worshiping.
Yeah.
Ultimately, a cruel God is not worth worshiping. They can be respected and feared, but not worshipped and loved. And so that Mormon God did not deserve my love or my devotion. So that kind of made it easy. Like I can worship some other God or some other power or some other force, or even just love one another. I think that's a really positive thing. But I don't need to worship a God that forces women into polygamy, that tells women they're second place, that tells gay people that there's something wrong with them and they don't deserve love, that tells people of color that they're cursed, that they've done something bad in their preexistence. Like that God who has hierarchies and values temples over the elimination of poverty, that God is just not worth worshiping, even if he was real, which he's not, because I can show you how it was all created if you look at the history. There's just nothing redeeming about that belief for me.
So I'll just ask you some of the historical points. So the first vision, Joseph says he saw God and Jesus. What do you think about that?
He can say whatever he wants, but first of all, he didn't mention it for 12 years to anybody. And he wasn't even the first person to say, oh, I saw God. This was like a very common occurrence in Protestant New England. Lots of people were having theophanies where they're saying, oh, God came to me in a vision. And his first account, it was a vision. It wasn't a visitation, It
evolved. It grew. The story grew.
It grew. And it was like, oh, God assured me that I was fine. And then suddenly, this power overcomes. But even the one where some power overcomes me and I saw two beings, someone was saying that in 1815, I believe. So he didn't even create that story. And had he created it, even if it had happened, which I don't believe it did, 12 years later is the first time he mentions it. And he doesn't say it's God and Jesus. He says it's the Lord, so
back when you believed God and Jesus were one.
Yeah, it just didn't add up. There were too many holes in his story for me to believe that this is an actual memory he had. It sounded like a story that evolved.
And then, and the Book of Mormon reflects a Trinitarian view of God, which was how he told the story in 1832. But then once his views on there being God and Jesus being separate, then all of a sudden he both changes the story by 1838 and he changes the Book of Mormon. He retrofits the Book of Mormon, or he fixes the Book of Mormon to reflect his own evolving view of deity. You think you'd get all that right the first time. If
God had said, this is my church and this is how it's supposed to be, you get it right because God's whispering it to you. God didn't make a mistake.
Yeah.
So if God's whispering, or, if God had gone through all these miracles to make this happen, it would have come out right.
What about the Book of Mormon? How in the world could a book so beautiful, so perfect, the most perfect book ever, how could that have come to be if Joseph wasn't a prophet?
I have to say it's not that beautiful or perfect. It was always, as someone who loves to read, it was always very difficult for me to read. I love to read. It was always a struggle to force myself to read this book. I don't think it's that brilliant. I remember listening to Stephen King talk about how when he writes a book, he writes it in a season, like 3 months. And his books are masterpieces. And those are like The Green Mile. It's a huge book and it's brilliant. And he wrote it in a short time. So to say that what Joseph Smith did was miraculous is not miraculous. It's like 8 pages a day. It's like normal writing. He wasn't even writing. He was just telling a story and someone was writing it down. So no, I don't think it's miraculous, and I don't think it can be inspiring, but you can even point to sermons that were being given in the area at the time. Like King Benjamin has this really great sermon, probably best part of the Book of Mormon. There's preachers preaching that in the area at the time. He's not creating anything. He's synthesizing.
Plus, he's literally, what's the word from the Bible? He's just copying the Bible over.
Right. So much of it.
A huge chunk of Isaiah. He's just literally plagiarizing. There's his own stories in there, his own personal narratives. Mm-hmm. And then a bunch of the New Testament, he's, Jesus stuff and the Sermon on the Mount. He's literally just
and wars and trying to make it sound all biblical and creating money and, and honestly being like, okay, so, and I remember saying this to my son who was trying to keep me in the church. I was like, okay, so let's just take the story of Ammon. There's no sheep in the Americas at this time.
There's no sheep. We talk about horses.
There's no
sheep.
So he's not watching a flock. And so my son's like, well, maybe he was watching llamas. I'm like, okay, fine. There's no sheep. There's no swords that could chop someone's arm off.
Yeah.
There's no metal that could do that there's no weapons like that. First of all, I don't even think
There's no swords.
Swords can't even really chop an arm off, not like that, I don't think.
Not
one
like
guy,
10 men,
10
20 men.
Yeah, you'd need to sharpen it between each one, I'm sure. But so there's no swords, there's no sheep. And then, he chops off all these arms and then goes and he's...
There's also no white people, by the way.
Right. We're not even going to get into that part. But then he's like readying the king's horses and chariot. And they're like, oh, where's Ammon? Where'd he go? Oh, he's getting the horse and the chariot ready.
There's no horses.
There's no horses.
There's no chariot.
There's no
wheels. The only wheels, I just finished Guns, Germs, and Steel. The only wheels they had in Mesoamerica were little toys,
yeah.
But they'd never drawn that. You know why? Because there were no animals to pull carts.
Right.
If they had horses and oxen
draft animals
in Native America, then they probably would have developed wheels.
Yeah.
But llamas and whatever, turkeys and dogs and whatever animals they had.
And no hardened steel in order to make wagons, in order to hold together for these animals to pull. Like they didn't have draft animals and they didn't have metal. Yeah. And so it's just this one story alone is impossible.
Plus, can one man, I think about Batman, that's fiction.
Yeah.
To have Iron Man or Spider-Man fighting 20 people, or Bruce Lee, right? Mm-hmm. No one dude can beat up 20 dudes with weapons. It's never going to happen.
Right.
Right?
The whole thing is impossible to happen pre-Columbian times, let alone... Even if we had all the technology, I would not love to see someone do that. It's impossible. So, even if you had a chainsaw, you'd have a hard time chopping all these guys' arms off. So I just remember, telling this to my son at some point, and he was like, huh. He had no answer. It's a cool story. But it can't be.
It's not a cool story.
It can't be history.
How is it a cool story that some man of Christ, and by the way, why are people worshiping Christ in America hundreds of years before he was even born yet?
Right.
And they know his name?
Right.
Even the Jews. How are they
doing Protestant Christianity?
Even the Jews that are the ancestors of Jesus didn't know Jesus' name, and they weren't worshiping him and ordaining and baptizing and confirming in his name. So even that's ridiculous. Mm-hmm. But then, why is a man of Christ, as a solution to a problem, why is he chopping off a bunch of people's arms? Like, that's going to last the rest of their lives. Why didn't he just use his power to cause a deep sleep to come upon them and they pass out, or he just disappears, or he uses his spirit to like rebuke them? Why is he freaking maiming them for life? And somehow that's a good story.
Right. Again, what kind of God are we worshiping that this is cool? Like, this is, chop off this guy's head. I know he's no threat to you. He's already passed out.
Drunk.
You could just take his clothes and do the whole thing without chopping off his head. But nope, chop off his head. This God is cruel and weird. And like, I don't need to worship that.
Okay, so no Book of Mormon, no First Vision. What about the priesthood restoration? Like, that's where a lot of like neo-apologists retreat to. Well, there needs to be authority, and the ordinances. That's Mormonism's contribution to the world. Yeah, all the churches are equal. We're a big symphony, and every church plays its role. But we have the authority. We have the keys. We have the priesthood.
It's funny. I was still in church attending, trying to believe, and somebody asked me to give a little, they were doing their Relief Society lesson, and they were like, can you talk about the three witnesses real quick for something? And I was like, okay, I don't know much about them. So I looked into it, and I saw, I think it's David Whitmer's address to something. And he was like, the priesthood did not exist. Joseph made this up, and all of a sudden said that Peter, James, and John, I can't even remember what he says in this document, but I was like, wait a minute, I thought all the witnesses stayed faithful. And here he is with this paper saying Joseph Smith the priesthood was not restored. These hierarchies that he's talking about, this is a new thing. Joseph's a fallen prophet. And even though I believe in the Book of Mormon, I do not believe in Joseph, is basically what this witness was saying, that I believed had stayed faithful, except for, for some reason had fallen away, but still believed.
Also, he was like, what's up with this Melchizedek priesthood stuff? There was no Melchizedek priesthood.
This is new.
In the founding of the church. Like, where did that come from?
They're inventing stuff. And so to have...
Which he did. He did. He invented the Melchizedek priesthood.
Right.
Years after he said it was given to him. He wrote that back in.
Yeah.
Years later.
Right. And here's one of the witnesses saying that. And I'm finding this out as I'm preparing a lesson. Like, wait, oh, I didn't know that. Yeah. So all of that. And my feminist self being like, what? I believe there are power and connection between people. I just don't believe the church has any different thing than anyone else. And finding out that women had given blessings and had done healings in the past, and that it had been taken away from women, from LDS women. Like, that was another thing that was like this priesthood thing. And also,
why would God choose this power, this privilege that only men can do?
Right. And to keep men on top.
Yeah. Why would God do that? Yeah.
Yeah. Not if God loves everyone.
Yeah.
But the Mormon God doesn't love everyone. That's clear. But, I remember when my son got the priesthood at 12, I remember him coming home, and I honestly remember him looking down on me after that, being like, I have more power than you. And I was kind of like, I am still your mother. And I'm still like, no. Just kind of being a little surprised that, oh my gosh, here he is like thinking he's better than me because he's got the priesthood. And I was telling you earlier, but for our marriage, once he stopped believing in the priesthood, that's when I felt like we actually got true equality. Because as he believed that he had something special that I couldn't have, there was still this kind of, like, even if he's like, oh, I'm only barely above you. Like, he still felt he was above me. He had more access to God than I did. And then once he knew the history about that and kind of saw how unequal that was and stopped believing all of the things, then we could truly, truly be equal. Like, the priesthood is set up. I mean, the Mormon church is made for men, white, cis, het men. Like, you get to be a god, you get to have all the women, you're going to have all the riches after you die. It is the, dream of a poor, urban, uneducated man to become the top of everything. And that's what this whole theology is for a man to get all his dreams, all the riches, all the power, all the women. That's what it ends up being for men. And the women are just tools in his tool chest.
So what about the temple? What about the endowments, baptisms for the dead? And what about eternal marriage and eternal families? What about all that?
So, okay, I was a photographer for a lot of years, and I did a lot of weddings. And I never did a Mormon wedding because I was too expensive for the Mormons. But, and also for a Mormon wedding, it's basically just a photo shoot. It's like a little portrait session. You're not capturing the most important part of the ceremony. So I can see why Mormons aren't going to spend thousands of dollars on a wedding photographer, because you're not even capturing the wedding. So I never did a Mormon wedding as a photographer, but I went to a lot of non-Mormon weddings, and they were incredible. Everyone got to go. They were the most beautiful thing. Everyone that loved this couple was gathered together to support this couple and to just shower them with love and affection. And it just felt so beautiful. And then you'd have a celebration after, and they were just the happiest, most joyous events. I went to dozens of them, and they were all more special than my wedding that had been in the temple that, none of my siblings had been able to. Well, Steve was able to go because he'd come back from his mission. Yeah, he'd gone on a mission. Steve pulled it all together, became a very good AP missionary, top of the line. But I had totally lost my train of thought.
Temples, temple marriage, proxy work for the dead, eternal families. Right.
So I still don't know where I was going. Damn.
So when you photograph these weddings, they
were amazing. And they were incredible.
The non-Mormon ones.
Yeah. And they were everything that my wedding was not on my wedding day, where I was, I had one sibling at the temple and my parents and, a bunch of people from the ward, whoever had a temple recommend, some aunts and uncles. But it wasn't like a celebration like these weddings that I had shot. And I just was like, wow, these are so much more alive and so much more celebratory and so much more special than this one where some guy I don't know is saying some words I don't really connect with. Everything about the Mormon temple ceremony was so sanitized, and you had to whisper, and you couldn't celebrate. Whereas, all of these weddings I was shooting, they were amazing and beautiful and outside, and everyone was there. There was nobody left out. And this all comes back when my daughter gets married later.
Okay.
But
what about though eternal family? So in eternal marriage. So forget about the actual.
Like all of these people's love was just as valid as mine. And if there's anything that binds you together, it's love. It's not priesthood. And I was realizing that they all believed they were going to be together when they died. They're like, well, if we're all in heaven, I'll hang out with you. There was no well, you might not make it.
Or you're in the lower part.
Yeah. Some of us will be there and some of us won't. It's like we'll all be in heaven together.
We'll come visit you.
Right.
We'll come down to your kingdom.
Well,
and visit you.
If we do it right, then maybe we'll be together. There was, so this is what I was telling Dave when I was like, if you need somebody to be sealed with, that's fine. But I believe that our love is what seals us. I don't believe some priesthood, some guy saying some words is what seals us. It's our love. It's our devotion. And I believe every marriage that I shot as a photographer was just as valid as ours. And their love was just as strong as ours. And ours wasn't any more special than theirs. If there's a heaven and there's a God, it's the love that binds you together. It's not the priesthood.
What about ordinances needing the right authority? So baptism, temple marriage, you need God's stamp of franchise approval, corporate signature, the keys.
So, yeah, it just doesn't make sense that in a world with so many billion people that God would give all of the keys and all of the authority to this tiny church in Utah. And not only does he give it all to this tiny church in Utah, in order to enact this, you're going to have to go spend 3 hours in the temple for each person that's ever lived. How is this efficient what kind of God is this that can't do his own work on the other side to say, you know what, I got you? Why do people on earth, why can't God do his own work, first of all? Second of all, it's so efficient. Why can't we just say, I mean, baptisms for the dead, that's pretty efficient. You can get a lot done in a little bit amount of time. But the endowment session, if we're going to have to do a 2-hour ceremony for every person that ever lived, can't God come up with a better system? So it just became so like...
Especially, I mean, for me, especially when there's so much poverty, so much racism, so much, abuse and illiteracy,
right.
starvation, natural disasters, war. And what we're focusing on is like, oh, I've got an extra 5 hours a week. I'm not going to go teach some kid to read or go sanitize some water.
I'm going to go watch a movie in this really nice building. And I'm such a good person because I watched a movie in this really nice, comfortable building.
Dressed up in white.
Yeah. It's the easiest kind of service that's possible. And it doesn't get your hands dirty. It doesn't make you uncomfortable.
It doesn't actually help anyone.
Right. My friend and I went to help in this like temporary shelter for the homeless in Reno, and it was so uncomfortable. I'm like, I mean, this is the kind of work Jesus was doing with the lepers and the poor people and the prostitutes or whatever. Like, Jesus was out getting his hands dirty. Mormons are not getting their hands dirty. It's really uncomfortable. And we can paper over that by saying, well, the slum is inside them and all we have to do is teach them to be like us and then they will be fine.
They'll lift themselves out of the slum.
Right. And so all we have to do is talk. We don't have to do anything else. We can send our sons out.
Or pray. Don't forget pray.
Yeah, you can pray, but you're going to send your sons out to redeem everyone and you're not going to have to get your hands dirty. All you have to do is serve your own people where it's comfortable and it's nice and you like each other and it's just so easy. And
you're all middle class.
White.
And you're all educated.
Right. I remember my friend pointing out why the effects of poverty are what causes so much of the crime and realizing that it's not knowing the gospel that makes people have problems. It's actually poverty that makes people have problems. It's having food insecurity and housing insecurity. And like all of these things make your life so stressful that you're going to escape in any way you can. You're going to try to get ahead in any way you can. It's the poverty that's the problem. It's not the lack of the gospel. The gospel's not giving anybody money. I mean, you believe it because this prosperity gospel's come up where it's like, well, if you pay your tithing, you'll get enough money. But that's just not true. It's not helping relieve poverty by paying tithing, right? Poverty's not being relieved by giving tithing to the church, especially if they're just hoarding it in some account. $100 billion hidden away for a rainy day. Today's not a rainy day. I don't know what is, but apparently it's not rainy enough yet.
So what about the argument that a lot of neo-apologists are making now? Okay, Book of Mormon may not be a translation. We might be one of many true churches. Every church is good. We all have something to offer. But this is just a great way it keeps your marriage strong, and it's a great way to raise kids. It's a great way to strengthen your family. It's a great way of life. It's my tribe. It's not about it being true. It's about it being just good and a good lifestyle, a healthy, clean lifestyle.
No. It undermined my marriage. It undermined my parenting. It undermined my self-worth. It is not. I mean, for some people who are loosely attached, I think it can be fine. I'm not going to say that in every case it's bad because I know that is not true. It's not bad for everyone. But I would say for at least half of the people, there's this fear, they'll lose their family if they don't live up to these things. I mean, Satan's threatening you in the temple. If you don't walk up to all of these things, you're going to be in my power. Like, that's the one thing they're speaking directly to you is when Satan is is threatening you. So this is the highest truth as a Mormon, and Satan's threatening you that you're going to lose everything, right? So, okay, I better like walk up to all these things. No, I think it can provide service and it can provide community, but everything that's unique about the church isn't good, and everything that's good about the church isn't unique. You can find those things elsewhere. And if it's coming at the cost of making your marriage weaker, it makes every relationship weaker. We can only have surface level conversations with our parents. We can only have surface level we can't show up fully in our lives when we have to believe a certain way, and we're afraid that we may not be measuring up. Everyone puts on a mask. Every relationship is so surface level, and it's sad. Like, I put so much time into this church. As soon as I walk away, every friend I had forgets me, and it's not, I know I took myself out, but I thought we were friends. I do have a couple of friends still, but the vast majority, these friendships were so shallow that they couldn't even take a difference of opinion. And, they'll take all the service that I can provide. They will give nothing back. They won't even say thanks for your 40 years that you've been here. In fact, not only not thank you, screw you if you want to see your daughter get married, because you walked away last year.
So what happened with that? Is there anything you want to talk about between losing your faith and your daughter's wedding?
No, I think that's pretty much in line. I guess 6 months after Cancun, my husband, or somewhere a few months after that.
Wait, let me just summarize that. So staying because it's just a good club, a good social club, and a good way to raise your kids, and a good just not taking it all seriously, just staying for the social benefits, staying for the spiritual benefits, not because it's true. No?
Right. Well, for a while I tried that. I was like, well, if it's not true, it can still be good. And the closer I looked, the more I was like, it's not even good.
Well, come on, you're seeing hymns.
It's poisoning women.
Youth programs.
It's poisoning gay children. It's poisoning men as they look at women. They're not valuing their wives appropriately. The women aren't valuing.
But the church, I'm playing devil's advocate. Right. But the church is getting better. They fixed the temple ceremony. They fixed some of those bad temple ceremony stuff.
They're not fixing
They
it.
They write the essays. Like, they wrote the gospel topics essays. They're being more transparent about their history. They made the temple ceremony less sexist. The women don't hearken under the husbands anymore. They're publishing Rough Stone Rolling and sharing it with the world. Women are now having leadership positions in the mission. They've given priesthood to the blacks. They're now, every other film shot of the Mormon Tabernacle Choir is one of the three black singers of the choir. So they're working hard to be more gender representative. Like, what's not to love? It's just it's a good way to raise a family, to live a happy, healthy life, be a part of the club.
I think it can, for people who haven't been traumatized by it. I have a friend who didn't, and I'd say, like my sister, who didn't get traumatized by it, who managed somehow to maintain their sense of self, and who've been just connected enough to get the benefits, but not so connected that they get the drawbacks. I am so happy for them. It can be okay, but the cost to all the other people, and the way that I think in some ways it also makes them worse, because they lose sympathy for other people. You look at poor people and say, well, if you just had the gospel, or if you were more righteous, it makes them worse people for the most part. It hides these systems of oppression. It makes them unwitting actors in a system of oppression. So even though, when people are like, well, the gospel's perfect and the people aren't, I'm like, it's the opposite. The people are good and they're trying their best, but this system is making them worse.
What about modern day prophets?
If they could prophesy, that would be cool. but they're like behind on everything and they're getting things wrong. Like, how could you have this inspired policy about the gay people and then 3 years later say, just kidding, we're actually inspired to do it away with it. Aren't we so cool? Like, it's the church has not led in anything.
Civil rights movement.
ERA, right? They
LGBT.
It's not that they were uniquely racist.
Slavery.
It's that they weren't uniquely not racist. They weren't leading out in any way, except I guess if you're a man and you want to be a god, they're leading out in that.
But they're not fighting slavery before its time. They're not supporting the civil rights movement. They're not supporting women's suffrage. They're not supporting the ERA. They're not ahead on the LGBT stuff.
They got it wrong about blacks in the priesthood. They
fought the civil rights movement and the ERA.
Right. Right.
They're racist. I mean, the church is led. It's racist, sexist, homophobic, anti-science,
and I don't
anti-intellectual.
Think that, again, it's not on accident. The church has some of its biggest growth between the civil rights movement and finally giving blacks the priesthood. I think it attracted white supremacists to the ranks by taking this racist stand and saying, well, I'm sorry, just white people are better. Sorry. They were more valiant in the pre-existence. Like, that's such a gross doctrine.
Okay. So do you want to talk to us about what happened with your daughter's wedding?
Yeah. Well, let's go back to just one more thing before the wedding is Dave leaving.
Okay.
So, I offered him the fruit of knowledge and alcohol and he accepted and we were both like, well, I guess now we'll be kicked out because we've taken this knowledge and this alcohol. And a few months after that, I was like, Dave, if there was proof that the church wasn't true, would you want to know? Like, would you want to know if the church wasn't true? And he was like, yeah, but there's just no proof. Nobody can prove that it's not true. And I was like, well, there's this document called the CES letter. Maybe take a look at that. And, it has some really interesting questions. And so, yeah, he looked at the CES letter and was like, oh, yeah, garbage. And he started listening to the Year of Polygamy just to kind of like fact check what I was listening to. And he was like, oh, this is problematic, So after that, he was like, okay, all right, we're done. And he actually also tried to stay as a cultural Mormon for a little while. But again, it's not good enough to stay because it's really just, it's not doing good for anyone but themselves. It's not serving the community. It's in little bits, but in appearance. So, okay, so Dave and I are done. We stop paying tithing. We stop wearing our garments. We stop attending. And, about a year later, my daughter's engaged and she's been at BYU. She left for BYU, Idaho, right about the time that I stopped wearing garments.
She went to Rick's too.
Yeah. And it was actually,
mother like daughter.
It was really traumatic in a way to drop her off, having lost my faith and being like, there are pictures of the temple in every room, and feeling that the temple is a tool of control by that point. I was like, this is gross. Like, they're just trying, if they can get people to the temple, they get them to pay tithing, they get them to do all the things. So if you hold the temple over their heads, they have to go through these hoops that benefit the church in order to make it to the temple and to be okay with their family. So anyway, she's at BYU, Idaho. I remember telling her before she left, I'm like, Shelby, just don't let it get inside you. I think it can be good. Just hold hands with it. Don't hug it like the church. Like, just don't let it be too much. But she went. And they just do their job there, There's so much peer pressure, and I could tell she got deeper into the church there than she had been the last few years because we'd been pretty like, I don't know, this, you know, I'd been in several years of decline and feeling like the church was good. So she was already kind of like, I remember saying, you should just hold hands with it. And she was like, I'm holding pinkies with it. So I was like, okay, she'll be fine. And she was a bit of a feminist. So I was like, she'll be okay. But, you know, it got to her. She met a wonderful guy, and he was a returned missionary. He'd been friends with one of her friends, like in his mission, her best friend was in his mission. And so she kind of like introduced them in a way. And she just fell in love with this fun, wonderful guy. And, you know, he's a Mormon, and he's getting married, and they're getting married. And by then she's into it more. And, you know, she's like, well, we're getting married. And I was like, well, I assume it's going to be in the temple. And she's like, yeah. And I was like, okay. And it was, I can't even tell you how hard it was to, first of all, knowing that weddings could be so beautiful. You know, I've been to so many beautiful weddings, and to be like, you're going to go do this wedding where I can't be there, where your dad can't be there, where none of your siblings can be there. And I know this is kind of the price of admission for getting this guy. So it wasn't that I felt like she was rejecting us. It just felt so sad that she was basically in the only church that was going to do this to us. Like any other church, you could pretty much go to a wedding. So I felt really unfortunate that we're in the worst church for being apostates when your kids are getting married. But on top of that, so it just felt so sad to be like, I've been here every day of my daughter's life. And why did they have this policy that if she could just even do a civil ceremony and I could watch that, I don't need to be there during the sealing, but I want to watch my daughter get married. And it just ate me up that in Europe or everywhere else in the world, you could have a civil ceremony and then go get sealed. And at that point, it was still the rule that if you had a civil ceremony, you had to wait a year before you could get sealed. And it just made me so upset that was only an issue here, and it had to be a tool of control. And so I was thinking one day, I was like, I'm going to write a letter to the First Presidency and let them know how cruel this is to keep a mother away from her daughter on her wedding day, to make her choose between her church and her love and her parents and her family. And as I thought about what I would write, I realized they've been doing this for 50 years. My grandma did not get to watch my mom get married because my grandma wasn't endowed. So her only daughter, she missed her only daughter's wedding 50 years ago. And I'm going to miss my oldest daughter's wedding 50 years later. And this has been happening every day for decades. And it's provided so much devastation. And there's no way the First Presidency isn't aware of whatever I was going to write in this letter. They're choosing to do this. And it just seemed so horribly cruel to make people qualified to be there to their own child's wedding. So I wrote a letter to the bishop and the stake president, and I said, look, I feel, I know the temple recommend questions. I don't make any money at this point, so I could say I'm a full tithe payer. Sure, I haven't been attending church, but you guys haven't asked me why not. And I feel like, I have a belief in divinity and that God's good with me. I follow all the rules. I'm not asking to go to her endowment. I'm asking to attend her ceremony like everyone else who's wearing just street clothes. You're not participating in the ceremony. You're just witnessing it. I was like, I am this child's mother. I grew her in my body. The final question in the temple recommend interview is, do you feel worthy? And I say, I I feel worthy. I've been there for this child in every way, every day of her life. If I am the most worthy person in the world to be there. And so I sent this letter, and I was afraid to send it because I knew that if they said no, that would kind of be it for me. Like, I would be so sad. And so I would start to feel angry at members of my ward. And for me, leaving wasn't about my ward. My ward was beautiful, wonderful people. It was the doctrines and the hierarchy that was my problem, and the whitewashing and the people themselves are innocent. It's the system that's the problem. And the people at the top of the system who could change it and don't. So I was afraid of sending that because I didn't want to feel resentment toward actual people. But I did because I was like, I have to try to be there at my daughter's wedding. And there was the option of possibly sneaking in, borrowing a recommend from someone. But at the same time, I was like, I want to respect my daughter's beliefs. I want to get in legitimately or not at all, because this is her beliefs. This is her husband's beliefs. I don't want to disrespect this holy ceremony for them. So if I can get in on my own accord, I'll do whatever I can. But I also have to be honest. I'm not going to get in and lie. So I was like, look, I think for these reasons, I'm worthy. I sent the letter, and he called me a few days later and said, I don't feel comfortable giving you a recommend. So, the day of her wedding comes. Well, the day before, I've been doing all this research and studying in my program and learning about systems of oppression. And I'd learned about all these like prison guards in Nazi Germany who weren't bad people. They were just doing what they were told. And I was like, that is exactly what's happening here. He's doing what he's told, and he's taking comfort in the fact that he's just following orders so that he doesn't have to feel responsible for cutting me out of my daughter's wedding. But he is part of the problem now. He has cut me out of my daughter's wedding. He hasn't pushed back on the system at all. He's an agent of this system. And I was just like, he needs to know how uncomfortable this is. I'm not going to just let him sit and be comfortable that he's made the right choice here. He made the wrong choice. And so I sent a letter of resignation the day my daughter got married to the bishop. And I mean, I can read that if you want, I've kind of told you what it was. Just like, if you don't and I said at some point, if you don't know the whole story, if you're only looking at one part of the story, back to the analogy, Hitler was a really great leader in so many ways to the right people. He was, making the trains run on time. He was good for the economy. He did all these wonderful things for the economy. But if you ignore the other things he did, you're ignoring a major problem. And I'm telling you, you're doing harm right now to me because you're only looking at the good side of the church. And that was basically...
That's how you read it. It's not too long. Do you want me to just show it to you here? You got
I
it
think
there.
I've got it.
So this is the letter you wrote to your bishop and stake president, basically expressing your frustration that they wouldn't let you witness or attend the temple marriage of your daughter.
Okay,
Is that
and
right?
yes, and let's be honest, this was the day my daughter was getting married, and I was torn up, and I needed some kind of outlet.
You needed to
I
vent.
don't regret sending this at all, and I actually wanted them to feel my anger, and that's why I didn't want to do Quit Mormon. I wanted them to know exactly what was happening. So I said, Dear Bishop, I'm not going to say their names, but Dear Bishop, stake president, and every single person on the leadership chain up to and including President Russell M. Nelson. I want you to feel more than the melancholy satisfaction of doing the right thing, which I assume you felt when you denied me permission to sit in the room while my daughter gets married. I'm sure you feel better when you tell yourself that I was ultimately at fault, that I could have avoided this whole thing by playing the game, staying active in church, paying my tithing, etc. But until you know the reasons I couldn't do that, you can't know the full story. Knowing only your side of the story and following the rules makes you more comfortable, but being comfortable is a terrible goal. It borders on evil because other people pay to accommodate for that comfort, whether it's with racism, sexism, classism, or in this case, religion. Comfort is the ultimate privilege, and you know when you're privileged when you're entitled to comfort. Stay ignorant. You stay ignorant on the issues because you're comfortable in a system that benefits you. You owe the world discomfort, and you are cowards doing harm if you refuse to sit in discomfort. I want you to know that I will be uncomfortable knowing someone else is helping my daughter get dressed and watching her get married while I sit outside. She is lucky to have support, but I'm left in the cold, literally. She got married in November. I have memories of her life that she doesn't. It is my job to remember and support her. And missing the opportunity to do that on her wedding day is killing me. There is no reason it has to be this way. I don't believe a loving God would do this. You need to be aware of my discomfort. This, as well as other things in the church, harms me deeply. And I hope you will challenge your comfort. This system is rotten in many ways, and for you to sit in the privileged position and judge me for whatever it is you feel I've done wrong while ignoring your part is horrific. Shame on you. I will deal with my own shame, but you need to be aware of yours too. Shame on you for upholding a system that helps so few, less than 0.01 of the population, and does harm to so many who don't fit their extremely specific mold. Shame on you for ignoring the rotten parts because you can identify and appreciate the good parts, which of course exist. Shame on you for not ultimately knowing the full, unbiased history of the organization you serve and vilifying those who do their due diligence and not making space for unbelief. Please understand, I don't think you are actually bad people. I think you are intellectually lazy and overly comfortable, which is irresponsible, which isn't the same as bad. These are sins of omission rather than sins of commission, but like most sins, it is fixable. Please pass my letter up the chain, and please remove my name from the membership records. I'm done. Sincerely, Shannon Montez. And I also said, Hitler was a good president. There's an asterisk. If you're only seeing one side of the story, it's a real problem.
I mean, everyone is writing how much they love that letter. They're so glad you read it. It's so heartfelt.
It did feel good to say, I want you to hurt a little bit because I'm hurting a lot.
Did they respond? And if so, what was their response?
Yeah, his response was about the stake president never responded at all.
No response.
Never.
To a heartfelt email.
Never said a word. The bishop responded with, Sister Montez, I was deeply saddened by your email and the hurt and pain you feel. I'm sorry you got hurt. I'm sorry you feel bad. I've requested that your name be removed from the records of the church. Please know that doing so cancels the effects of your baptism and confirmation as well as temple blessings. If this is still your desire, please let me know and I will begin the process. Respectfully, Bishop, And I was like, what good are the blessings of the temple to me now? Why are you saying that I'm going to lose this? I already did. I lost the big thing already. So, so I sent that. It felt a little, it felt good to feel anger instead of sadness, which obviously I still feel sadness about. But the day of her wedding was one of the most difficult days of my life. Because, as a good parent, You have to be happy. You know, it's not about me. It's not my day. It's her day. And this is what she chose. And I want to support her in every way. And if she wants to get married in the temple, I want that for her. It's not her fault. So I had to smile while my heart was breaking. And, you know, it was so hard to pretend like this was such a happy day. And I was trying to find all the good, happy things. But honestly, one of the worst parts was the lack of acknowledgement that this was hard for me. So many friends and family members walked, like, her flowers weren't done on time, so I had to take them into the temple after she was already in there. And I went to the front desk and I'm like, my daughter needs her flowers. And they're like, who is she? And we can't, you know, it was just kind of chaotic. And several friends and family members walked right past me and could see that I was stressed and trying not to be upset. And they just walked past, you know, like, there was no, like, Steve and Mindy, I remember Mindy feeling, I could tell she was kind of pissed that whole day, and I was glad. Part of me was just, like, glad that she could see how unfair this was and how hard it was to celebrate.
Did Steve and Mindy attend?
Well, they sat outside with us.
Okay, with you.
But, yeah, I actually got as many people as I could to sit outside the temple with us so that I could feel like we were still celebrating. But the lack of sympathy, just knowing that everyone's there, like, well, she knew.
You chose it.
You could have done it.
Yeah.
That lack of sympathy is so cruel. And that's why I'm saying it takes good people and makes them bad.
Or do bad things, yeah.
Yeah. They're not bad people, but it justifies bad behavior. Like, what I needed were hugs and, like, support. And they were supporting Shelby, but nobody was supporting me. In my, like, good Mormons felt just that I was deserving of this when I had been a good mom. Nothing I could have done would mean that I deserved to miss that. Like, there's nothing that I could have done. She loved me and I loved her, and I created this person. I shepherded her every day of her life. There's nothing I could have done that would justify this. It's absolutely cruel and unusual punishment for something as small as losing belief.
Yeah.
And yeah, 3 months later, they changed this policy so she could have had a civil ceremony. And that it just almost made it worse. No acknowledgement that 50 years, my mother couldn't see my pain because she knew that her mother felt my pain. And it was so hard for my mom to see me suffer that she avoided me the whole weekend. I stayed at her house to actually start my thesis. I started the research that weekend because it was like around Thanksgiving. And my mom avoided me. And I had to ask my dad, like, where's Mom? Why is she avoiding me? And he's like, oh, she's not feeling well. And then she didn't. But I could just see that it was too painful for her. And we couldn't have this discussion. And I needed my mom. And her mom needed, like, she didn't get to see her get married. It's just to think that this devastation has happened for generations. I mean, in my own family, my grandma felt terrible. My mom, her wedding's not her favorite memory because there was hardly anyone at her wedding. There was me getting traumatized by missing my daughter's wedding and my daughter getting traumatized by missing her mother on her most important day. I didn't get to help her put her dress on. Or, like, my sister was there and that was nice, but I'm her mother. In one family, that's a lot of pain that was completely avoidable, and they were completely aware that this causes pain, and they didn't care. And the people walking past me didn't care. And so that's what I'm saying. It does bad things with good people. It undermines their ability to be empathetic because they're so concerned about being right. And it does some real harm to a lot of people when being right is more important than being loving.
Yeah. I'm so sorry.
It's still kind of fresh, although it's been like a year and a half. It's just, it was so hard.
Yeah. Well, we've got just a few minutes left, and you have to go to Bear Lake, and I have to catch an appointment. But for those of you who missed it this morning, we did several hours on this amazing master's thesis, the Secret Mormon Meetings of 1922. We're going to be covering this master's thesis. It's all about B.H. Roberts, his discovery, a Mormon general authority and church historian, discovering that the Book of Mormon is not historical. In the 19-teens and early 1920s, his alerting the general authorities, the First Presidency, the Quorum of the 12, sitting them all down in a 2-day, 3-day meeting and telling them that there are significant problems with the Book of Mormon. We already covered that earlier today, and later we're going to talk about, after the brethren ignored B.H. Roberts and blew off his concerns and tried to ship him away. Right before he left, B.H. Roberts picks a bunch of Mormon intellectuals and starts having these meetings to try and work with unofficial Mormon intellectuals to try and find a way to make the gospel work and to make the Mormonism still work, with the Book of Mormon being so problematic. I can't wait to get to that, but I want to end. I kind of named this podcast From Mormon Housewife and Mother to Historian.
Yeah.
Let's just spend the last couple of minutes talking about this amazing 4-year journey of you deciding as a mom to pursue your master's in history, how you decided to study Mormon history, why you did it, and what it all meant. And we've literally only got like 10 minutes.
Okay,
So we'll have
I'll
to do
make
it all.
Quick.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I lost my network. I needed something new. And I'd always imagined going back to school because, first of all, I couldn't do anything with a history degree. I'd at least need to get my teaching certification. So I'd always known I would go back to school, but a master's degree just sounded so interesting. And, my husband had a job as a CFO of a company. And so my income wasn't needed. And I just was like, this would be really good for me to focus my energy and time on something. And so I decided to go get this master's degree and just learn more about American history, which I was really amazed at how much I had missed as far as history goes in the first degree in high school. This degree was focused more on race, ethnicity, gender, and religion. And it was amazing, and it was wonderful, and it was such a good experience. When it came time to choose a thesis, at first I was like, I don't really want to do a Mormon topic. I just, I'm not feeling healthy in this regard. But as it got closer, I was feeling just more curious about Mormon history. And it's been so much more interesting now that I don't have to protect a testimony to be able to look at the full, nuanced history, all of the good and the bad. And, it's just a fascinating American movement, whether or not I believe it's just such cool history. And so I kind of thought, you kind of should work with what you know. And so I kind of was like, here I am after a faith crisis. I wonder how I'd seen these B.H. Roberts documents and the studies. I'd heard that B.H. Roberts, did he or didn't he lose his testimony? I'd heard that debate. And I thought, how did all the other people feel about this information? And so that's what I originally had set out to do, is see if I could find information whether or not the apostles, if I could see a change in their beliefs. turns out, again, that was such a naive thing, thinking the church was just going to be like, yeah, here, look at all these journals. But, in my first foray, right after my daughter's wedding, as I mentioned, to actually do the research is when I came upon Richard Lyman's journal that had this list. And I was like, this is interesting. I wonder who all these people are. And then I, found more names to add to this list. And as I discussed this with my professor, afterwards, she was like, I think you're really onto something. And it's really fascinating that there were women there and, that they're discussing this outside of church circles. She's like, I really think you should explore this. And, at first I was like, I don't know, how can I make a whole thesis out of a list of a few names? But the more I looked into each person that was in attendance, the more they just each filled in this beautiful picture of what Mormonism looked like in the 1920s in this little window of like liberal, where they were choosing whether or not to become more liberal or more conservative, whether to accept or reject science, whether to remake themselves after polygamy was over into, more mainstream Christianity, or to try to become a more distinct people like they had been. Like they were in this crossroads. And I've just found that this little window of time just illuminated so much about Mormonism and the choices that have been made since and during that time, and really illustrates almost for me an alternative view of what could have been. When we see these people in high callings saying things that were just so interesting, and like what we would say now is more liberal, and saying, having more room for God and having more room for goodness, and not having it be so much about rules and having it be more about goodness. So I just found that each person I researched added a little more clarity to this moment of time in Mormon history. It was just such a beautiful time that it was such a pleasure to write and to learn about all these people and to get to know this little window of choice.
And this will be sort of a kind of a spoiler or a sneak preview of the hours that we did before, or the stuff that we'll do after. But what were 2 or 3 like big conclusions or highlights or aha moments from your study?
Well, one of them was one thing that I found was so fascinating was how Gordon B. Hinckley wrote a biography of James Moyle, who was the person who hosted these meetings, and seeing clear whitewashing happening by Gordon Hinckley, who was like my favorite prophet. He seemed to be like so good. And so Moyle gives a talk shortly before he dies, talking about how he had met, I think it's David Whitmer, and asked him about his experience, and realized that the man was talking about a visionary experience. And he's saying, I was disappointed. He didn't talk about them being in seeing them physically in location.
The plates or the angel or what?
He says, I was disappointed that it wasn't as material as I had thought. And, this was like in his early age, and he it seems forgets this or suppresses this information in his own memory. And later, comes back to it, looks at his journal, is like, oh yeah, he didn't say he saw it in person. And he gives this talk, and it's printed in the Juvenile Instructor or something like, some magazine, church magazine before Correlation. And he's like, here's why I think the prophet's still prophet, even if the Book of Mormon wasn't physical, which is such a crazy thing to have been printed in a church magazine. And I think it must have caused an uproar because that is all erased in his biography, and it's hard to find Moyle that Hinckley wrote.
Yeah.
And this whole Moyle's one of my favorite characters or people. He's a real person, not a character, but one of my favorite people in this, because he shows, how the struggles of getting an education, from, leaving the state and how he had, practicing law, the politics that was going on, up at the higher levels, and the whitewashing that his biographer was being pressured to say things in a certain way, even though Moyle's not even an apostle or church person at all, besides a believer. So he was an interesting person. And I think it's because he had this piece of information from a witness who's saying, well, I saw them
with my spiritual eyes.
Eyes. And he was like, wait, what?
Not your real eyes?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that information got suppressed.
Yeah.
That's just one instance.
Yeah. I love the part about B.H. Roberts. Again, we've already talked about this, but just you pretty much demonstrate that by the end, B.H. Roberts did not believe the Book of Mormon was historical. He still believed the church was good, that the gospel would be good for people.
Yeah, Christianity is great.
But we have B.H. Roberts basically on one hand saying, if this isn't what we thought, it's a fraud. Mm-hmm. But then once he realizes that it wasn't historical, that Joseph didn't use Urim and Thummim, that there weren't plates, and that it's not a real history, then he's like, well, there's still goodness here.
Yeah. Well, maybe we can still salvage it, but.
Yeah. Yeah. And then just we talked about this in the previous set of interviews, but just the systemic corruption. The whitewashing, the hiding of evidence, keeping it from the members, punishing people who tried to talk about it. It's really.
And if you're going to put everything, your own life, if need be, on the line for this church, shouldn't you be given the whole story?
Yeah. Really quickly, for women out there, or anyone, but women specifically, who, let's just say they've gotten married and they've had a bunch of kids, but now they're realizing that the church wasn't what they thought. And they're saying, well, my life wasn't, I could have had choices, but now I've got all these kids. And they're thinking about like, well, I want to do something cool, but how do I do it? I'm married, I have kids, I'm middle-aged, I'm in my 40s or 30s or 50s. You did it. You said, hey, I'm a wife, I'm a mother, the church isn't working out for me, but I'm going to spend several years, get a master's degree, and write a really cool thesis that I think is a major contribution to Mormon history. I think this is as important as Greg Prince's David O. McKay book or Leonard Arrington book in terms of the puzzle pieces it puts into the puzzle. This is a crucial puzzle piece that you have put in place for me. That for me is almost, the institutional corruption is almost a smoking gun in and of itself. And this really comes out in this thesis. So what encouraging words would you say to a middle-aged Mormon mom and wife who's thinking, do I go back to school? Do I do something else? Do I start a job? What can you say to them to give them encouragement?
I don't know if I'm in a position to do that because I'm still figuring it out myself. I loved going back to school. It was so fun to do something for myself and to, use my brain and like be respected for the things that I was thinking. And that was amazing. I'm not sure where I'm going next. This is new. I just finished the thesis in December and just, COVID hit. And so nothing's happening right now. And I don't know. I don't know that I have advice. I still feel a little upset.
Or even encouragement. Even encouragement.
Yeah, do it. Just.
How did you do it when you had lots of kids and? Well,
okay. My daughter had already left for college. My kids were the youngest was in middle school. So I was there are seasons of life. And if I had tried this earlier, it would have been much harder. But, with 3 kids at home and they were all at school all day, it was mostly something to it was exciting and fun to do, but it was more flexible than a job. And it was such a joy to do this. So yeah, definitely do something for yourself. I'm not sure where this will lead, but I hope to do more of this kind of work. Researching I felt like a detective. It was so much fun to just be like, oh my gosh, nobody's talked about this before. This is so exciting that I just found something that nobody knew. And I can tell somebody something that's new information that kind of paints the picture in a little more detail. And so that was really exciting. I loved being in the archives. I loved reading the old letters. It just felt like such an adventure. So if you like history, do that. But not everyone does. So what worked for me may not work for others.
Well, Shannon, you are inspiring. You're super thoughtful and lovely and articulate. So many people are saying this is their favorite Mormon Stories episode ever. That's, there's 1,350, so that's a big deal, even if one person feels that way. But I just have to tell you all, this thesis is a delightful read. It's a compelling read. It's well written. It's super thoughtful, and it gets right to the meat from page 1. And it's meaty all the way to the final page. There was not a page. If you look at my marked up version of this thesis, every single page has markings. Some pages, the whole freaking page is marked up with stars and underlines and smiley faces and frowny faces, which is how I mark up books. So it's amazing. Read it, get it, buy it. Check out my previous episode with Shannon on the B.H. Roberts story. It's a crucial story to understanding modern Mormon intellectual history and, frankly, church corruption.
And that's the dissertation. That's a lot more information than this provides. But what I provide in this thesis is kind of a delightful little
It's amazing.
Collection of stories.
Super important. Someone's asking if your husband resigned to Jeff. Hey, Jeff, I'm also friends with Jeff and Lindsay, and Jeff says your husband did resign.
He resigned actually before I did.
Okay.
I had planned to stay in the church.
Yeah.
Like, it's just my heritage. I love being a Mormon. I don't love a lot about it, but I love the history and I love the people, and I still feel like they're mine, and I can push them to be better as well as anyone else. And that's, I love the people. I would love to help them feel more free in their religion or out.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your gift of your history to us. Thanks for the gift of your story, your courage, your poise, your thoughtfulness. You're awesome, man. The Caldwell family.
They're the best.
Jeff, Steve, you, what a family.
Dave, he's amazing. He's not here this week with me, but
kudos to Dave for choosing you.
I just need to make it clear he's a wonderful person, and the church kind of gave us some bad things to work with.
Systems, not people. But I'm glad you guys worked through it. Glad you're happy.
Yeah.
And thank you so much for listening. Thanks to everyone who tuned in. Please share this with everyone. Tell everyone. Please support Mormon Stories. With COVID-19, donations are way down. It's got me worrying about what I'll be doing in the next year or two, starting to think about other jobs. I don't want to stop doing Mormon Stories. I'm okay now, but we need donations and support. So if you value this work, if you want to see it continue, please go to mormonstories.org and become a monthly donor. It'll mean the world to generations to come if you can. Leave us positive reviews on YouTube, on iTunes, on Facebook. Share it with everyone. Email me with questions or support. Check out our website. And just thanks for all the support. It means the world. And for those of you who are donors, for those of you who do support us, thank you so much. You make all the difference. And thanks to Mindy and Steve for turning me on to Shannon. And love to the Caldwell family. And, we'll be bringing Shannon back again to talk about her thesis more in depth. But you guys take care for now. And again, Shannon, thank you so much for coming on Mormon Stories.
Thanks. It's awesome.
All right.
It's fun.
All right, everyone. You guys take care. Thanks so much for joining us.